this flight here that's getting ready, the big gaggle to take off. We've got over 50 airplanes involved in this strike force, and it was going to be a big raid up near the Hanoi area, but the weather's bad. Now they're going to various other areas. A spares job. For every 4 airplanes we launch one spare off the end of the runway. In case one of the airplanes that we're having trouble with, they can fill in any 4 positions, any one of the 4 positions. He's usually a leader, so in case the leader aborts, he can fill in that spot. You can see this flight taking off now, and the airplane standing by is the spare. He'll be coming back up like me probably pretty soon. We like to fly in flights of 4. That's why we have a spare out there, because if we didn't, we'd never get another airplane up in time.
This is an F-105G, the Wild Weasel variant of the Thunderchief. The last mutation of a plane that when first produced was the biggest single-engine, single-seat fighter aircraft ever built. The F-105 was an awesomely powerful weapon, and in the skies of Vietnam, it was to become known as the one-man Air Force. The designer of the F-105 was Alexander Katvelli, chief designer at Republic and no stranger to the concept of big fighter aircraft. For he had been the designer of the World War II P-47 Thunderbolt, the biggest single-engine fighter of its day, which has been produced in large numbers and had proved itself a sturdy workhorse not only in its intended role as an air superiority or escort fighter, but as a fighter bomber in the tactical support mission. Work on Advanced Project 63, the series of design studies that led to the 105, commenced in 1951, at the height of the Korean War. Essentially as a privately funded update of Republic's F-84. The 84 had been developed as a jet Thunderbolt for the escort and tactical fighter bomber roles. In Korea, it proved not up to the escort role in competition with the MiG-15, but it performed well in the ground attack. The 84's straight wings were part of a very conventional overall design. And indeed, the plane's latter manifestations exhibited swept wings more appropriate to the potential speed of the jet. But with the experience of Korea to guide them and the rapid pace of technological development to compel them, the design team soon realized that they were setting out to design a completely new plane. As a team at Republic was setting out on their project, the counterparts of North American company had just received U.S. Air Force support for the F-100 Super Sabre, first of the series of planes known as the Sentry Fighters that were to cover the multiple fighter roles that perceived as the Air Force moved to supersonic capability. Starting life as a reworking of the successful F-86 Sabre, the F-100 was originally described as an air superiority fighter, but its latter variations added fighter bombing capabilities. With a maximum speed of 860 miles an hour, the Hun was USA's first supersonic fighter, and, particularly in tactical support role, was to prove valuable in Vietnam. The next plane was the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, designed as a penetration fighter and escort fighter. The rapidity of development in aviation can be judged by the fact that, though only ordered 12 months later than the F-100, the 101 had a top speed of 1,100 miles an hour. Again, the plane developed tactical capability in its later models, and it was used extensively in Vietnam, most notably in photo reconnaissance. Third of the century fighters was the F-102 Delta Dagger from General Dynamics, an all-weather interceptor commenced in 1950. Capable of 820 miles an hour, it proved only a moderate success, but naturally was to develop to become the F-106, which had a top speed of 1,500 miles an hour. The Lockheed Starfighter, the F-104, ordered in March 1953, sought flight performance at all costs as an air superiority fighter. Basically a manned missile, the 1,400 mile/hour 104 had a checkered career, but has demonstrated amazing longevity as a tactical strike and reconnaissance aircraft. At Republic, Clark Belly's team working on Advanced Project 63. After a program that ran to 108 configurations had emerged with a design for a single-engine, single-seat tactical fighter bomber with the capacity to carry nuclear weapons in an internal bomb bay. This plane, the 105A, was given Air Force approval in September 1952, originally with the intention of mass production, but in the end only 2 were built. The 105, rounding out the Sentry fighters, was the first purpose-designed tactical strike aircraft ordered for the United States Air Force. The perception of need for such a plane derived from a combination of Korean battlefield experience, geopolitics, and interest-service competition between the strategic and tactical air commands of the USAF. For TAC, the 105, in addition to opening up parameters of their new conventional role, brought with it the capability to carry nuclear weapons over a long range, with a corresponding rise in their prestige to rival that of the Strategic Command. The Tactical Air Command support of the 105 was to prove vital to the project as the plane went through its difficult early years. Virtually all the technology and engineering of aircraft were being revolutionized at once, in response to the myriad physical changes inherent in the transition of the age of supersonic flight, and the F-105 was to have plenty of developmental problems in the years ahead. But what made the huge fighter so special was its large internal capacity. The atom bombs, more reminiscent of drums than weapons, gave it a potency far beyond any competitor. For the F-105A, significant breakthroughs in understanding the effects of transonic drag, together with some inherent deficiencies, had already seen the design superseded. It first flew for the 3 years after the USAF go-ahead, and then by then its internal systems had changed beyond recognition. Also by then, manufacture of its replacement was underway. The third F-105 was the first of the B model. We see it here on the 26th of May 1956 as it taxis to its takeoff point for its first flight. This was the first 105 to have a power plant big enough to match its size, and major external changes had also been incorporated, chief among which was the area ruling, which had rescued the F-102 from its drag and turbulence problems. This had replaced the straight lines on the A model with a slim hip over the wing. A massive 4-pedaled air brake now dominated the previously clean lines of the engine exhaust, and there had also been changes made to the air intakes, giving the Thunderchief its characteristic nostrils. A larger tail area had increased stability. These and other changes have resulted in a plane with the capacity to double the speed of sound. Perhaps symbolically, this first flight was to be beset by almost fatal problems. It was intended that the flight be short, little more than a quick circuit. But when it came time to lower the wheels, there was no response from the nose wheel. Raising and lowering the wheels had no effect. The nose wheel would not budge. Rather than abandon the plane, it was decided to attempt a wheels-up landing, and so the test pilot set the machine down on a long, dangerous slide across the salt. Eventually, the plane came to a halt, and emergency crews converged on the site in the slowly clearing dust. The crash was more than an intense embarrassment for a project that was already being scrutinized as excessively expensive and troubled by technical problems. However, it was still possible to argue that the problems were being solved in ways that consistently improved the overall capability of the plane. And that even as simply as a test program, the 105 was revolutionizing the understanding not only of the science of aviation, but the potentiality of a tactical aircraft. The cause of the crash was soon identified in the new air intake controls, which at the high thrust settings were jamming the wheel in a position, a fairly simple thing to correct. One other thing that the crash demonstrated was something that those who flew the Thunderchief in action came to know and approve of its toughness. The plane was lifted, the undercarriage was lowered, and the prototype was towed away to be mended and rebuilt. Rebuilt, the plane rejoined the test program. As work progressed on tying together all the systems and ironing out all the bugs in the components, the engineers were dealing with concepts and forces they could only barely control, and overcoming the snags as they appeared. It's difficult to think of any other way that these problems, theoretical and practical, could have kept up with the intense scramble of technical development. In being the first plane capable of both air-to-air fighting and air-to-ground semi-automatic weapons delivery, the plane relied on avionics packages far in advance of anything previously attempted. Among these advanced facilities were radar models for air search, contour mapping, terrain following, and automatic tracking of air and ground targets even in blind conditions. Throughout its life, the 105 was to almost constantly receive new and updated facilities, but even from the first, this was a plane that was far ahead of its time. The rebuilt plane was allocated to conduct the spin testing program, a spin recovery parachute which installed on the tail of the plane. This required removing a panel to afford room for the chute and removing the air brake so that, if needed, the chute would be unimpeded. Trials on the chute demonstrated that it worked satisfactorily. The aim of spin testing is to ensure that the plane can be recovered from a spin to normal flight. That, once control has been lost, it can be regained. Of course, the first thing to do in such a test is to lose control of the aircraft deliberately. Then, the test pilot sits there while his plane plummets through the air for a specified duration, and then he attempts recovery. This is not for the faint-hearted. The emergency spin recovery parachute was not needed, as the planes proved to have a natural tendency to level out after each revolution, and the pilots were able to resume control fairly easily. However, the airframe still had to be tested, and so the trials went on. "47 times the pilots let go and watched the horizon slide away slickingly as the plane commenced its fall. If you look carefully here, you'll see a pillar of flame leap from the tail of the plane as the engine stalls. Though the flight test proceeded well, the technical problems persisted. With the engine and the avionics still unreliable, the uncertainty of performance was matched by a wider uncertainty about the future of the plane. The original expectation of large production had been amended to 37, then cancelled altogether in December 1953. A reinstated order in February 1954 was for 15 aircraft. But by September, this had already come back to 3. In October, it was back to 6. Parallel for this state of flux, the operational requirements for the new fighter had already been repeatedly amended before being first published in December 1954, and, by April 1955, had been changed 3 more times. The men conducting the test series went on with their work, while uncertainty continued to shroud the future of the project. The 105's already considerable range had been augmented by the addition of external fuel tanks, and these two had to be tested to establish the effect they had on the plane, as well as to test the tanks themselves. Throughout 1957, the testing went on, with the test aircraft logging many hours over the desert as the plane was slowly sorted out through multiple modifications. The pre-service evaluations due for completion in November 1959 were to eventually go on until March 1961. Of the specifications added in 1954 was that the F-105 should be capable of in-flight refueling, another recent innovation already being widely used. With an airplane like the F-105, this was a tricky proposition. For the fighter pilot to slow down to the same speed as the tanker left him with insufficient airflow over the wings to maintain lift. The top speed of the tanker and lowest speed of the F-105 were very close, and, as you see, the fighter becomes very hard to maneuver, especially in the turbulence of the larger plane, and often stalls entirely. Attempts to alleviate the problem by handing jets to the tankers, as here to a B-29, didn't help all that much. All supersonic fighters had trouble until jet tankers raised the speed of refueling to safer levels. The test confirmed the difficulty for the pilot of the fighter, and although successful couplings were made, the system remained largely impractical. Not due to any failure of the F-105, but because of the inadequacies of the tankers. Having the drobe trail from the wingtip rather than from the tail of the plane removed the operation from the worst of the larger plane's turbulence, and facilitated matters somewhat. but the tendency to stall still remained. The equipment in use, the long drogue hose, did not make things any easier with the requirement for the pilot of the fighter to maneuver onto the drogue. Not until this necessity was replaced by a system where he simply holds position in relation to the tanker and the operator in the tanker directs the connection was refueling truly a practical affair. The F-105 was equipped with 2 types of refueling connectors, and these were to see a lot of use in the Thunderchief's career. Back at the Eclipse Super Sabre variant. Had the 107 been compared to almost any other plane at the time, it may have outperformed it. However, the 105 was a rather special opponent, and the performance of the controversial big plane was beginning to quell the doubts about its worth. The revisions of the Thunderchief specifications had continued in a stream of expansions of its system's capability. Constant electronic elevations proceeded throughout the plane's development and its operational lifetime, continuing to maintain the F-105 at the forefront of performance. The plethora of design changes meant that the first 15 F-105s produced represented 5 distinct subtypes. Eventually, there would have been 19. During the test program, of course, the revisions of the plane meant that the trials were regularly extended. The normal flight testing programs were consistently completed with little trouble, as the airframe behaved very well and had admirable flight characteristics. However, the electronics of the newly conceived and developing systems caused continuing delays as their performance was lifted to their supposed specifications. With the benefit of hindsight, we can appreciate what a fine aircraft was evolving in the process. But at the time, eyebrows were being raised as there was considerable skepticism about the plane. On the 28th of May 1958, 3 years later than originally expected, the USAF took delivery of its first operational 105. Fittingly, it was the only one of its subtype. The Air Force pilots had been disappointed to hear that their new mount was in fact a rather large bomber, and had christened the plane in advance rather disparagingly as the lead sled, Thunder Thud, or Plane Thud. Now, they got their hands on it for the first time and immediately changed their minds, and Thud in particular came to mean F-105. But no longer in any derogatory sense. The big plan was to be universally popular with those who flew them. Not only did it handle and perform as a fighter, but it packed a combination of punches that was truly awesome. Fully laden, a 105 could carry 14,000 pounds of a very wide range of external stores, including all normal bombs, rockets or rocket pods, cannon pods, electronic countermeasures, packed air-to-surface missiles, and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. But almost as the reason for its existence, the Thunderchief also had a bomb bay. To minimize supersonic drag, the bomb bay doors retracted neatly into the plane. To control the ejection of the bomb, both for accuracy's sake and to ensure the bomb was clear of the aircraft, it was pushed down with a pneumatic rack. The rack was strong enough to be used as a jack to load the bay if there was no bomb trolley available in wartime operations. However, the Thuds carried very few bombs internally. Most of the time, the bomb bay was occupied by a further reserve of fuel on the outer wing. There was a provision for 2 stores pylons to be fitted. These could be used to carry weaponry and fuel in any desired combination, or removed to allow the attachment of specialized delivery racks for other armaments, like this installation for the Sidewinder. The standard build and armament for all Thunderchief variants was a General Electric M61 20mm multi-barrel gun. This gun fired at 6,000 rounds per minute and could fire off the entire 1,029 shells it carried in less than 11 seconds. Air Force deliveries continue with the 335th Tactical Air Squadron, becoming the first fully equipped with the new fighter and celebrating by setting a world speed record. In 1961, the first overseas deployments were made to bases in Germany. Far away from Europe, the summer of 1964, so the Thud goes into action for the first time. Soon, they were sporting new camouflage as they were deployed in larger numbers to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. From those bases, they launched the campaigns that were to write their name into history. For the F-105, Vietnam was the right place at the right time. Even during their service life, up to that time there had been continued problems with reliability, and as recently as 1962, they had all been grounded. Though those problems had been ironed out, the plague of minor defects and a series of accidents had continued almost up to their first Vietnamese missions. But the Thuds in Vietnam were to earn a completely different reputation as reliable and duro airplanes. They also earned a fearsome reputation as weapons. The importance of the Thunderchief in Vietnam can be simply indicated during the first 5 years of their involvement there. They flew an amazing 75% of all USAF attack missions. If the skies of Vietnam were full of bombs, it was because the Thuds put them there. From March 1965, increasing numbers of airstrikes were made on North Vietnam, predominantly directed at communications targets. The raids relied almost entirely on the F-105s. The planes would heave themselves into the air with their loads of bombs and head for a rendezvous with a tanker near the North Vietnam border. But with the level of external stores they were carrying, and the way that increasingly they had to fly flat out all the way across Vietnam rather than cruising to and from the target, the range had been cut considerably, and even with full tanks, the journeys didn't leave much to spare. Then, they flew into hostile airspace. At the beginning of the war, the North Vietnamese had only limited air defenses, and the earliest raids were relatively quiet. Soon, however, supplies on anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and MiG fighters began to multiply. And the raids were flown into the teeth of the most intensive air defense systems ever tested in warfare at that time. Production of the 105s had been completed in December 1964. Only 78 of the B model had ever been built. The remaining 610 had been F-105Ds. The D had acquired an extended nose, accommodating all-weather navigation systems, and thus was externally dissimilar to the B. The other 143 were the twin-seat F model. It had always been expected that there would be a twin-seat version of the plane, but two earlier twin-seat proposals had been dropped. The Fs were to provide the stock for the later development of the last 105, the G, the Wild Weasel. The workhorse of the bombing raids was the D. The single-seaters are bounded on the bases where the work of war went on 24 hours a day. At the end of each mission, the returning pilot would confer with his crew chief about the performance of the plane and handed it over to him for service. The service record of the F-105s in Vietnam was excellent. On any given day, over 90% of the funds were ready for work. This figure was higher than the overall average within the USAF, and considering the complexity, workload, and relative scarcity of the big planes, it's all the more outstanding to keep them in the air. Facilities for total maintenance of the planes were built at the bases they flew their missions from, and specialist teams were constantly available to fly in to handle specific problems. Teams of ground crew at the bases carried out the normal turnaround routines, like refueling, filling the water tank in the tail for the afterburner, rearming the plane, and other servicing required between missions quickly and efficiently. The body of the plane was a patchwork of hatches, allowing access to the equipment inside. The big fuselage had very little spare room inside it, but the layout was good enough to ensure that servicing was relatively straightforward. The bases were a far cry from the mud and improvisation of the Second World War. A Thunderchief parked on Takhli's acres of hearth stand could be serviced with relative ease. The wing point combinations for the next missions were selected and effected, and the plane armed in the smooth and practice routine. A large part of the bombs that were dropped on Vietnam were iron bombs of the Second World War. Vintage, sadly, they were a part of a design philosophy and era that should have been long gone. However, modern smart bombs were not to really arrive in Vietnam until the F-111s used them in the last phases of the conflict. So the F-105 missions were often flown to deliver hardware that was uncontrolled in flight, often unstable in trajectory and sometimes unreliable in effect. But with these bombs, the Thuds hammered the North and in most instances destroyed their allocated targets right through the night. The bases were a hive of activity. At the work of repairing, servicing, and arming the planes went on. Another factor that makes the 90% availability of the Thuds even more impressive was their toughness. They kept coming back from missions with major battle damage to repair. Thuds sustained strikes from SAMs as well as AAAs and mid-cannons and still survived. This one has actually survived a hit from a Sidewinder. Each morning, the one-man's air forces waited ready. In March 1965, the USAF flew the first of the Rolling Thunder series of strikes. The inclusion of the reference to Thunder is fitting, as throughout its 3 years, Rolling Thunder was to be the almost exclusive province of the Thunderchief. The fuller extension of the air war into the North had 3 purposes. First, to reduce the infiltration of the South. Second, to give pause to the communist leadership in Hanoi. And thirdly, to bolster the morale of the Southern leadership and the people of South Vietnam. As the name implies, the strikes rolled forward into the north, targets being progressively further and further over the border, and the thunder was real. The damage to the North's bridges and railways and roads extracted a great cost on the communists and hampered their war effort considerably. However, though at times apparently shaken, the Hanoi leadership did not break. The Thuds flew in on their deadly missions, and the Vietnamese tried with everything the Russians and Chinese could give them to knock them from the sky. North Vietnam was not an ideal target for a sustained bombing campaign. There was little industrial infrastructure to damage and almost no war production. The country had an agrarian society, predominantly rural and dispersed. The few major targets in the terms of docks and storage were within the exclusion zones around Hanoi and Haiphong, the 2 major cities. For political reasons, these areas were not bombed for most of the war, as the US consistently tried to negotiate an end to the fighting. The Thud pilots learned their own ways of coping with the streams of sands that rose of them, splitting and diving to confuse and evade the missiles. In tangles with the MiGs, the 105s came off well. They had such reversive power that if a MiG managed to get in position to fire, they could in most cases simply accelerate away from them further. The Thuds were capable of turning the tables on their attackers and really mixing it up. 28 MiG-17s were down by 105s. The bombs continued to rain down on Vietnam. Supporting the bombing was an electronics and communications network of unprecedented technical sophistication. Operations controllers directed a huge fleet of varied craft in the air at enemy level, from artillery spotter planes to B-52s. They dispatched rescue operations for downed pilots and coordinated the activities of tankers, bombers, and fighters. Off the coast of North Vietnam prowled the Big Eye planes packed with sensitive radar and alert for the slightest activity from the mid-squadrons. Any appearance of the MiGs was monitored and the information relayed to the fighters in the area. The constant observation, coupled with the air superiority of the Phantoms and Thunderchiefs, served to ensure that for the large periods of the war, the Communist Air Force stayed on the ground, pragmatically accepting that they could not compete. The controllers and their equipment directing the airstrikes were themselves part of a chain of command that stretched back from the Vietnam through the Pacific headquarters in Hawaii all the way to Washington, where the targets were identified and authorized. At the very end of the chain were the Thuds, sending off daily with their loads. Thousands and thousands of sorties succeeded one another, with the F-105s carrying most of the load. Whether or not one questions the strategic effect of the program, it is impossible to not acknowledge the burden that the Thunderchiefs carried and the effectiveness with which they pursued their assignments. In June 1967, the first of the Thuds to do so reached the halfway point in their theoretical 4,000-hour fatigue lifetime, to be followed soon by others. The most critical fatigue concern was the strains upon the engines. The missions that the Thuds were flying were unlike anything originally envisaged. They were regularly returning at full power with afterburner for extended periods of time. The stress on the power plants was enormous. The hot sections of the huge J-75 engine were particularly vulnerable to this type of treatment. Already, there had been some shortages of spares. As a safeguard, their normal engine life between changes was reduced from 200 to 125 hours. And teams of mechanics worked on overhauling the engines, testing them and reinstalling them on the planes. By August 1968, the 388th Squadron was flying Thunderchiefs with 3,000 hours under its belt. Having gone out on 500 missions, received flag damage on several occasions, and have been involved in mid-air collision earlier in the year. By October, 3 more had passed the mark. They were growing old fast. An earlier suggestion to reopen the lines and build more F-105s had been considered, then dropped. There was a replacement for much of the work already available in the Phantom, and construction was proceeding apace on their successor, a design that had been much influenced by the story of the Thud and which had reflected many of the lessons learned in its combat life, the F-111. For the time being, the Thuds remained indispensable, and they were constantly tended to maintain their status and prolong their life. The Thuds remained in Vietnam to the end. Not only the 2-seater SAM suppressing Wild Weasels, but also the Ds and Fs with their bombs, tactical support, and electronic countermeasure systems. The Thuds were still workhorses right through to the devastating Linebreaker 1 and 2 operations that finally brought the North to a negotiation position that allowed the US to withdraw from the conflict. Their bombing had sustained the air war against North Vietnam. There was no other plane at the time that could have done the job. The bombing was fiercely pressed home, and the results devastating, particularly when they were directed against a specific industrial target, as here on this truck maintenance depot. The Ho Chi Minh Trail buzzed with activity during the bombing halts, with trucks bumper to bumper, illustrating 2 points: the wily resolve of the Vietnamese in pursuit of their aims, and the effectiveness of bombing. With Thuds about, the trucks were far more circumspect. The pilot's tour of duty was 100 missions, and the Thuds saw hundreds of pilots through their tour and home again. They were men who were undoubtedly universally glad to be out of the war, glad to have done their job and survived. However, many of them were still to miss their big machines and the sensation of howling through the air at a huge metal monster at twice the speed of sound. Captain John Piawani began growing his mustache when he first arrived in Vietnam in 1967. When he finished his 100th mission, the mustache was 12¼ inches long. On his 55th mission, his Thud was hit by artillery over the Paul Duma Bridge, near Hanoi during a bombing run. His story is typical. Not only did he hit the bridge and bring down a span, but the damaged Thud brought him home to finish his tour. Some of the Wild Weasel and other specialist planes stayed with the USAF after Vietnam, but the 105s were progressively phased out and retired into the hands of the pilots of the Air Force Reserves. There were not too many of them about, and they faded rather quickly from use. The last reserve of an F-105 was on the 25th of May 1983, exactly 25 years after the accident on the first flight of the 105B. Many pilots sat in the seat of an F-105 and went through the startup process. Many owed their lives to them. Most of them consider their plane the best in the inventory. The big fighter grew from its problem childhood, and the parameters of what an aircraft could be asked to do grew with it. In an era of multiple transitions, it is an astounding achievement that so much was got right so well in one package. There were never that many of them, and their reputation is perhaps not widespread. Nevertheless, the plane was certainly outstanding.
Okay, my name is David B. Waldrop, W-A-L-D-R-O-P. So I was a first lieutenant when I did my combat tour in Vietnam. I actually flew out of Thailand at both Korat and Takhli. I started at Takhli, I was TDY from Yokota. But I was a first lieutenant my entire tour. I was fortunate enough to be born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, which I think is one of the greatest places in the world, especially in the 50s when I was actually growing up. You know, Nashville was a city. It had everything to offer that cities have, but yet just a little outside of town, it was rural. And my dad used to raise hunting dogs, bird dogs specifically, and we used to hunt and fish. And back then, you know, even as a young kid, I mean, I could, when I started driving, I could knock on a farmer's door and say, "Sir, do you mind if I go hunting on your place?" And he'd take a good look at you and he said, "Do you know how to hunt? You know how to handle a gun?" I said, "Yes, sir. My dad taught me well." And he said, "Well, you're not going to shoot any of my animals, are you?" And I said, "No, sir. That's not what I'm here to hunt. I'm ready. I want to hunt some quail." And yeah, and they would let you do it. You think about doing that today? Forget it. But I grew up there, and it was an awesome place to grow up. And you know, we could go outside when we were little kids before we started driving. And you'd go out on the weekends and stuff like that. Your mom and dad wouldn't see you all day long, but they weren't worried about you. You know, we were safe. And we'd wander all over the place. We used to spend more time outside because we didn't have video games, TVs even hardly back then. And so we were outside all the time, and usually barefooted. And so it was an awesome time. And it was, and looking back, especially now, it was an innocent period of time. You didn't have the preponderance of crime and all the social issues that otherwise the social aspect of things was great, and it was a safe place, and you felt secure, and you felt comfortable. So yeah, it was a great place to grow up. I went to Hillsborough High School, which was that was another great place because it was a good school. The teachers were good, and we didn't have a lot of kids that were mean or anything like that at school. It was a big school too, and so that was a great part. And then I tried to play football, and my dad actually, he used to play on one of those local teams, and I've got a picture somewhere. I wish I could find it. I've looked for it, showing this cast of characters. And I mean, these are guys that you wouldn't want to come up against on a football field. And I mean, they had the old leather helmets, and they took a team picture after a game, and I mean, they were nasty, covered with mud, and they looked the part. And you know, Dad wanted me to play football. Of course, that's just what dads, you know, do with their sons, and I wanted to play. But I weighed all of about 120 pounds when I started high school. And I was a skinny mini, and I'm still not very big. And I'd go out there, and you know, they say, "Oh, you got to hit the big guys low," you know. And I'd run as hard as I could. I'd try to hit. We had a fullback that weighed 220 pounds, and I'd try to hit that guy when he's doing an in sweep, and I'd bounce off him like a little dog. You know, but it was just. I said, "Good Lord, give me some weight, something to work with here." But anyway, so I didn't become a big football star, as you can well imagine. But I did try, and so you know, we did all the swimming and the fishing and skiing, and we had a lot of lakes around Nashville. And a buddy of mine and myself, we used to go duck hunting by ourselves. At 16 years old, we'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning on our Christmas break from school, and you know, tow a boat down to Kentucky Lake, which is about 70 miles away from Nashville. You're 16 years old. Do parents let their kids do that kind of stuff today? I don't think so. And we'd go out there and hunt ducks, and we'd find ducks, and the ducks would come to us. We'd actually call them in and everything. I remember one time we went down there. I know this is probably going to be long-winded, but we went down there. It was so cold, one of those fronts came through. We had a boat, and the water because it rained first, and then when these flash freezes came in, it dropped down about 20 degrees. The boat froze to the trailer. So we get down there and back up trying to get this boat off the trailer. It won't come off, it's frozen to the trailer. And I pulled my pants off, my boots off, and I walked out in this ice water and literally rocked the boat and finally broke it loose. And that's just what we did. And so it was great. And you know, I had my first shotgun, I think, when I was 13 years old. And it was just a different time. But it was great. It was fantastic. TV came about probably, I guess, when I was somewhere in grammar school. And we had one of the stations in Nashville. There was only 3 at that time. Used to close out their evening broadcast at 11 o'clock at night with the poem High Flight.
I have slept the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, when never lark nor even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind, I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand, and touched the face of God.
With a 104 in the background doing rolls and just the clouds, and I mean, it just grabbed me. Plus we had a guard unit that was flying F-84s, and although we weren't really near the airport, their pattern would take them pretty near our house, and they'd be in fingertip formation. You know, you'd see those guys, and I look up at, God, that's so cool. And nobody in my family had ever even set foot in an airplane, but that was it. When I was 16, I decided I was going to be a single-seat fighter pilot, flying in the Air Force. Not the Navy, not the Marines. I didn't even know the Marines had airplanes, actually. But not in the Navy, but the Air Force. That's just what I decided I was going to do. And so I pretty well oriented everything I did from that point forward to go that direction. And I got accepted to Vanderbilt University. Now, I'm not the brightest candle on the cake by any means, which Vanderbilt's a pretty tough school, but I did get accepted, barely. But they had naval ROTC. Well, that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to fly in the Air Force. And so I knew, you know, I did enough research, and I found out that what I had to do is come out of college with a degree, and the best way to do it would be to go through ROTC, so you come out as an officer. Because I did talk to some I guess, counselors that knew, and so I said, I'm going to University of Tennessee. Well, that saved Mom and Dad a lot of money, because Vanderbilt was a private university, although, of course, I was living off away from home, but that was also good. And so I went to University of Tennessee, and once again, I could not have picked a better school for David Waldrop. Actually, I went by the name Barry because my dad was called David, his dad was David, and so they call me B for Barry. That's what the B stands for in my name. And so I grew up being that, and so I went to University of Tennessee, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I met some of the greatest guys who I still keep up with to this day, and we get together every once in a while for reunions. I was in a fraternity up there, and that also was really, that was a maturing actual experience, because there were certain roles of leadership that you could actually assume by being in a fraternity, which I did. And I was never president or anything like that, but I did several different things that allowed me to grow up and mature in that respect. And so I had a lot of fun up there. In fact, I had so much fun, I spent 2 extra quarters before I could graduate. And but then finally, you know, I was ready to get on. I was ready to go start flying airplanes. And of course I was very lucky. This is something also that's very important. To be medically fit to get a pilot slot in the military was really a critical and non-negotiable aspect of getting into a pilot's slot. Fortunately, I was medically completely fit. My eyes, my hearing, and everything, all that was satisfactory, so I was able to get a slot in pilot training. And I passed all the appropriate tests and so forth. So that's, you know, when I extended and stayed in ROTC, at that time, every male had to go through 2 years of ROTC at University of Tennessee. No choices. That's just the rules. But then if you want to stay on and get your officer's slot, then you had to, you know, the 3rd and 4th year, you also had to be in ROTC. And so that's what I did. And one of the guys in my fraternity was in ROTC, and so he started flying with me when I was a freshman. And I was able to start getting a little bit of stick time and getting the feel of it. And I knew that, you made the right choice, because that's the first time I flew in an airplane. And even though I'd never been in an airplane, I knew that this was it. I mean, I'd get up there and boy, the exhilaration and the excitement and just the feeling of making that airplane do something while you're up in the sky was fantastic. And so anyway, then your junior year, well, actually your senior year, you go to a 6-week military camp your junior year, but then if you're a pilot candidate, then your senior year, they would send you to a local airport where you'd actually learn to fly and get your wings. You know, not your wings, military wings, but you'd get, you know, a pilot's license. And that was, I got about 35 hours there and got my pilot's license. And I remember one time we had a little airplane that's called a Shin 2150, which was a tandem seat. You sit one behind there. It looked like a miniature T-34. And I thought that airplane was just so cool. And I went up and I'd fly it. And I went up one day by myself and I did something I shouldn't have done, but I did it anyway. And because our commandant of cadets for the ROTC unit, they'd bring a T-33 jet trainer up periodically. It was you know, tandem seat also, and I got to ride in it a few times. And of course, he always would do a roll and do some maneuvering and stuff like that. And I thought that was cool. So I get in this little Shin one day and I said, you know, I'm gonna do one of those rolls. So I didn't have a clue how to do a roll. And I sort of pull the nose up a little bit and I put the stick over, and of course, in an airplane, once you get sort of like this, the nose is gonna wanna drop. And it did. And so I kept on, here I am going straight down at the ground. I'm seeing the red line. I said, oh my God. And I started pulling, and the G's, I felt the G's. That was cool, I like that. But I said, I ought to find out how to do this first, so I do it again. So I went in and I talked to Colonel White, and I said, by the way, you remember when you did that roll? How'd you do that? And so he started telling me, he said, no, I said, well, I wound up, he said, oh my God. don't do that anymore. That airplane's not even aerobatic. You're not even supposed to do aerobatics in that airplane. I said, oh, really? So I said, okay. So, anyway, I didn't do any more of those, but, and then of course, finally I graduated in December 1964. I was supposed to have, and this is sort of how, I had a lot of luck when I was in the military. And I really did, in a lot of places, a lot of different times. I was supposed to have a March class in the Air Force to go to pilot training. So I graduated in December. I was going to go home and I wouldn't report to the Laughlin Air Force Base till March. And I about drove Colonel White crazy. I said, sir, I'm ready to go now. I've been waiting for this all my life. And he said, well, you know, they come up with these assignments and everything. You got to just take what they give you. And I said, can you just talk to somebody, please? And so he's okay, I'll do my best. Well, damn if he didn't go talk to somebody, and I got a January class. So I wound up going in, and here's the irony of the thing. I wound up going in January, starting pilot training. The March class, and I can go into more detail, but I got an F-105 assignment. I had to work my ass off. But I got an F-105, which I wanted a single seat fighter, and that was one of the 2 airplanes that I wanted to fly when I was 16 years old. And the March class, they didn't have any 105s. I mean, no, you'll never know how it changed my life. I mean, it completely oriented my entire life. And that was sort of interesting also when I was at pilot training. I'll skip the first part because it's T-37s. Everybody goes through the T-37s. But then a good friend of mine was a fellow named Pete Foley. He was in 6 months ahead of me. So in other words, we were going like this. So I go where he leaves. So, no, he was not. But he got an F-105 assignment also. And his instructor was a fellow named Chris Paterakis. And Chris Paterakis was a guard guy that had come on back on active duty that used to fly fighters in the guard. So I mean, he was the real deal. And so Pete told me, when we got to be really good friends, he said, Dave, you want fighters, you want an F-105 or an F-100, you got to get Chris as your instructor, and you're going to be taking our place. Let me introduce you to Chris, and maybe he can get you as his student. So he did, and so Chris did get me as one of his students. Well, the first thing an instructor does when they start out in flight training is they will sit down individually, student, instructor, by themselves. Say, what do you want out of this? What's your goal? Of course, Chris already knew what mine was because I had met him and Pete had introduced me. He had told him, this guy wants fighters as bad as I did. Well, but when we sat down, what he said to me was, he said, I already know what you want. That's easy to say you want something. Now is when the test starts because you're going to have to back it up. Because the other 2 guys, they really don't care what they get. They just want to get their wings. But you want something. And I'm going to be on your back 100% of the time. Nothing is ever going to be good enough. And you're going to have to work harder than anybody in this whole squadron. Are you willing to do that? I said, yes, sir. And I did. If I was 10 feet off, Dave, what's wrong with your altitude? Well, I'm working back to it. I mean, that's what it was the whole time. And finally, at one time, the coup de grace sort of came after we did our formation and so forth. I remember one time I was leading and you know, you'd fly solo and I was leading back into the formation, and they had turned the airport around because of wind changes while we were out, and I didn't know it and I didn't get the information correctly. So I'm leading back the same way we started out, and all of a sudden over there, I've got the flight, get on my wing. So I hopped on his wing. We go back out, re-enter us. Oh my God. We got on the ground, and I mean, Chris walked over to my airplane, and it was everybody on the flight line could hear Chris just absolutely wearing me out all the way back in. Of course, I got a big old pink on that ride too. But my formation was good. and I was doing a night formation sortie, and the wing commander at Laughlin and the squadron commander needed a night formation ride. So Chris set it up so that I did my solo ride with them. Now, when I was flying with Chris, we sort of were doing some pretty good, we were doing 90-degree wing-overs. More than 45 was all you're supposed to be doing. We were doing 90-degree wing-overs, and I'm hanging right in there. And Chris was he was absolute atom bite, smooth. If you've got somebody on your wing, this is what I'm learning to fly formation. He said, don't ever let them know they're even in a turn. Make it so smooth they don't even know they've started a turn. You know, he said, that's the whole key. And so I get ready for this night formation ride, and Chris says, Dave, I want you to do exactly what we were doing the other day. And I said, sir, it's night. And I said, besides, we were supposed to be doing 45. He said, if they don't come back with their flight suits soaking wet, I'm gonna pink you. And of course it was a full moon. And he said, it's a full moon. Nobody will have any trouble seeing each other. So I went up, and I mean, here we are, night. 90-degree wing. And we get back on the ground, and I got in the room, and I saw Chris, and he said, well, did you? I said, well, I did what you told me, sir. So I'm standing about as far as me to Scott from Chris, and those two characters walked in. They were full colonel and a lieutenant colonel. They walk in, and they stop right in the doorway. And they look at Chris, and they looked over at me, and one guy didn't even turn his head, he just looked back at Chris. Did you put him up to that? Chris said, oh God, Dave, what did you do? And I said, I flew like you told me to do, sir. and Red Wine, who was the squadron commander, started laughing. He said, I think I have seen it all now. That's the first time I have done 90-degree wing-overs at night on some brand new pilot's wings. And I passed. Anyway, the formation night flight was toward the end, and at that point in time, I had my F-105 assignment, and that was one thing that Colonel Redwine said, what kind of assignment did you get? And I said, I got an F-105, sir. And he said, well, you ought to do well. And we graduated. We started in January of '65. I graduated in February of '66, and then. We had, back then they used to group all the students from all the different training bases into one big list, and everybody was ranked according to their ranking, and also what their instructor, their recommendations, and so forth. And so anyway, they had 6 F-105s and had 5 F-100s. Now those were the only single-seat fighters that we had. So we had 11 single-seat fighters, and there were 225 students. So Chris got me my single-seat fighter. And I went to Nellis, and my class, though, didn't start till May. So I had really February to May. I wound up going to survival school up at Reno at Stead Air Force Base, which was great since most all of us were going to Vietnam. So we have a February Stead survival school and had to wear snowshoes. Somehow or another, going to Vietnam with snowshoes didn't seem like the right program, but that's what we did anyway. And so most of us were hopping backseat rides with instructors, which you could do, and then you got you familiar with it, started getting you familiar with the airplane, that giant airplane. And our class started in May, I think it was, of '66. And now here's another interesting. So I had Chris Padarakis. By the way, what I didn't say about Chris Padarakis is this. He applied to the Thunderbirds while I was his student. Well, the 1st of January, he left me as my instructor, and he went to the Thunderbirds. He got selected to fly left wing on the Thunderbirds. So you can get a little bit of an idea of the mentality, the demand for perfection, the absolute acceptance of nothing outside the box. It had to be constantly the best of the best. Well, I go to Nellis, and I get an instructor who doesn't have the same uniform as the rest of the Air Force guys. He's a Navy exchange pilot by the name of Harley H. Hall. And I'll tell you, then I'll give you the rest of the story. When I'm out there just starting formation flying with Harley, over the air, for everyone in the world that's on the frequency to hear, Dave, smooth, smooth, smooth as the skin on a maiden's breast. Every fighter pilot that was on that frequency, of course, had to chime in and jump in on top of Harley. But you know what Harley later became? Blue Angel lead. Oh yeah, we lived off base. I was living in an apartment right off the strip. Wow. I tell you what, for a bachelor in Los, the only problem was I didn't have any money. I had a red Corvette, and a third of my paycheck, and I mean 1/3 of my paycheck, was going to my car payment. But I had my little red Corvette. I was a fighter pilot. You know, you got to do what you got to do. You know, you can't drive old junk heap around. That was, and of course at that point, it was everything Nellis had ever been, because Vietnam was full board. And so everything we did, and we flew when I was learning to fly. I mean, they were pushing, and we were getting really aggressive. We were getting low. We were getting fast. We were getting demand. They were pushing us as far as we could go as students, because they had to get us ready, because most of the guys were going straight to Vietnam. And the 105 used to be, it was so complex and so fast. In fact, the final approach speed on the 105, on the single seat model, was 185 knots. Now that's basic, plus fuel, 5 knots per 1,500 pounds of fuel over 1,000. So you were coming down the final about 190 knots. That's over 200 miles an hour. It's the fastest landing airplane we had in inventory. And at one time, you had to have 500 hours of tactical fighter time to get in the 105, because it was so complex, because it had terrain following radar. It had a fire control system that was extremely capable, but is also very complicated. And so a guy like me, back in the early days, I wouldn't have even been able to get a 105 assignment. But Vietnam changed everything, because then they needed to bring in fresh blood. They needed to bring up guys. So those of us that instructors felt could handle the airplane got to have the opportunity to fly it. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. Actually, my whole class got orders to go to Yokota Air Base. And we all thought, well, gosh, I thought we were going to war. And we had 6 guys in my class, and all of us went to Yokota. And that was because they needed to fill in Yokota, which had a nuke alert commitment, and they had to keep that fully manned. It's the best thing, once again, that ever happened to me, because when I got over to Yokota, I wound up in the 35th Squadron, and there was a captain there by the name of Robert Spielman, called him Spiels, and he was sort of a country guy also, in terms of he liked to hunt and fish. And so we just hit it off, and they had a couple of motorcycles there, and so we started riding motorcycles together, and we got to be really good friends, and he was a weapons officer. So we would fly a lot together, simply because he could fly with me. And once again, I mean, he just pushed, he pushed, he pushed. He let me lead, and when lieutenants were not even supposed to be leading, but when I was with him, he would always make me lead part of the flight, get on the wing, and he would always maneuver, always maneuvering the airplane, always working me out. And he let me do stuff that none of the other lieutenants over there even got to do. And I know one time lieutenants were never supposed to ferry an airplane solo from Osan, which is where we did our Osan, Korea, which is where we did our nuke commitment. And so we were going to come back together. there was 2 airplanes that needed to come back to Yokota. So I was in one airplane, he was in another one. We get up, fire up and get ready to go, and his airplane goes down. Now, he's supposed to have cut me off at the same time. He didn't. He said, Dave, we need to get that airplane on back. I'll take the heat. So I took it on back. Well, halfway back to Yokota, I had a complete electrical failure. Here I am by myself at night, and I have a complete electrical failure. And we had, it wasn't an overcast, it was, you know, I didn't have a visibility problem. So I wanted to bring the airplane back to Yokota by myself, had stuck a little pencil flashlight up in my helmet to shine on my instruments that we had standby instruments over on the right side of our main instruments, they were gone. But we had little standbys. So I got back to Yokota with the airplane, and Spills, never anything ever came of it, because they didn't really, the head guys never knew about what took place, other than, you know, one came back with an electrical failure. That's all they knew. But Spills said, I knew you could do it. I said, I wasn't planning to do it this way though, sir. And we went out one day on a dart mission, in fact, right before I went to Vietnam. And this was sort of interesting too. I was flying number 2 on Spills' wing. Now dart, do you know what a dart is? It's a long silver winged device that is towed behind another airplane. In our case, we towed it with a 105. And they would let the dart out, and then when he starts a turn, he'd clear you in, because he wants to be out of the line of fire. You'd be off to the, for instance, like on the right side, he'd start a right-hand turn, so he's clearing. Well, then you shoot it, you come in, roll in on this dart, and you shoot at it to you know, learn how to air-to-air shoot. And it's hard, it's not easy, it's not a real big target. So Spills went in and he didn't hit it. And so I came in and blew it away. I come off and get on his wing. We had 2 other guys, and one of them was the 5th Air Force, one of the colonels. Colonel Batzel, actually was his name. And he was flying number 4. Well, number 3 comes in, he fires, didn't hit it. Well, they had a dart spare, I'm sorry. I hit one, then they had to dispatch that one. They had a dart spare airplane, because this was real critical. We all got our air-to-air renewals. And so they brought in the spare. So number 3 goes in, he didn't hit it. Number 4 went in, and his gun jammed, so he didn't hit it. And so Spill says, well, we still got a dart. I'm fired out. Anybody got anything? And so I waited, because I'd already got a dart. And he said, Dave, how about you? And I said, well, I might have something left. He said, go for it. I went in and I did press. And I hit that thing, and I mean, it literally just, it exploded. And I had a high G over the top over the thing. We got back on the ground, and Colonel Batzel said, you were really pressing on that target. And before I even had a chance to open up, Spill says, sir, this is one of the things we've been trying to ingrain and teach into our drivers, is sometimes they're going to have a close-in shot, and they need to have the flexibility and be prepared to handle these situations. So I got 2 darts on one mission, that's pretty cool. I mean, that was right before I went to Vietnam. Okay, when I first got to Yokota, I wanted to, the guys were walking around at Nellis with this 100 mission patch, and I really wanted that 100 mission patch. It was one of those goals that I had, is to get that 100 mission patch. So when I got to Yokota, I went down to personnel, and I volunteered for Southeast Asia. I didn't have a clue at this time. I was the only one that had volunteered to go to Southeast Asia. So in May, I think it was April or May of '67, and like this was right following those DART missions that I had. They got an order to send 5 guys TDY from Yokota to Takhli Air Base to fly combat mission. I was just a lieutenant, and I was the first one called up because I was the only one with a volunteer statement. And so then, of course, there's a lot of guys who wanted to go. They just hadn't thought about putting in a volunteer statement. And so, anyway, they filled up real quick. So 5 of us went down, and we went to Takhli, and I wound up going to the 357th Squadron. It was the 355th Wing at Takhli, and the 357th Squadron, and got to fly with some really, really great guys. And then this is where the rubber meets the road, as the saying goes. And once again, this is where my 6 months of experience with the 105 really, really, really paid off. Because I knew the airplane extremely well. Because like I said, Spiels had pushed me. So I was able to assimilate into that role pretty quickly and effectively. Nobody had to worry about where I was. I was always going to be where I was supposed to. I was going to do what I was supposed to do. And because I knew the rules and I knew why the rules were there. And that's part of the training that I had gotten. And so started flying. The first 10 missions you fly, they get you easy missions, the lower route packs, or I even had some Laos missions, which we weren't in, but I had some Laos missions anyway. Dang. Those Blue Jays are really raising Cain back there. Then you start flying Route Pack 6. Now, Route Pack 6 was not a friendly place to be because they had more guns, missiles than anything, from what I've been told by the old heads, that we ever faced. And the flak sometimes would really be horrendous. But one mission, it was sort of interesting, actually, because when I first started flying the Pac 6 missions, the guns were quiet. I couldn't believe it. We'd roll on the target. I was expecting all this stuff to come up, nothing. And then July, I think it's 4th or 5th came along, and we're going against Kep Airfield, and I'm flying, I think in the second flight. Bob White was leading. He flew with our squadron actually, and he was leading the force in against Kep Airfield, which is on the Northeast Railroad, which is northeast of Hanoi. That's why they call it the Northeast Railroad. And anyway, we roll in, and all of a sudden I see something I hadn't seen before, and these red streaks were going by my cockpit. And it took a little bit for me to realize that's flak. It hadn't gone off yet. That's the flak going up. And then this horrendous explosion took place right underneath me. And I mean, it literally, I'm in a 45-degree dive, and I was doing 550 knots. It literally, it was like somebody took you and hit you in the back as hard as you could. And it's just, I mean, the whole airplane just completely just moved, and it rolled me upside down. Here I am going straight 45 degrees down at the ground, upside down now. And I thought I'd been hit. I mean, there was no doubt in my mind that I'd been hit. And I checked my gauges real quick. And this is where, knowing the airplane, everything felt solid. And so I kept the roll going, and I rolled it out. I checked the gauges real quick. Everything was still in the green. And so I continued. I dropped, came off the target, and I looked up and I saw a sight that I'll never forget. One of the guys on the first flight had been hit in the belly. We had a belly tank, and fuel was just pouring out, and he was a ball of fire all the way back. And Give me a second. Anyway, I pulled up beside him, and he had a real high angle of attack, was climbing, and this fire was just pouring out of the back of his airplane. I pulled up alongside of him, and I didn't know for sure who it was, but I said, I'm out here to the left of you. I'm out to the left of you. You've been hit. Lower your nose. You got too high an angle of attack. You're going to lose it. Lower your nose. And the nose came down a little bit. And he said, it's getting sloppy. I heard him say it over the air. And I said, try to head a little bit, bring it over to the left more. And he said, I can't hardly see. It's too much smoke. I said, roll a little bit left, roll left. Trying to get him out to the sea. Try to get him out where he could have a chance maybe to get out of the airplane. And he sort of rolled, but then he said, I'm starting to lose it, I'm starting to lose it. And I said, well, don't get out of it before you lose it, because what would happen if you got an angle of attack in the 105, if you got a high angle of attack, the nose would just slam down like this, and then when you punch, you're off the seat, and that seat comes up and hits you, but it can really hurt you bad. So I was trying to keep, it was obvious he was going to bail out. So I said, get out of it before you lose it. Well, so anyway, he leaves the airplane. So I went back, I joined up the tanker, get home, and the crew chief, of course, they'd come up on the airplane and say, how'd it go? And I said, well, check the belly. I might have taken a hit. And he checked it, and he said, yeah, there's a hole in the bottom of the airplane. And after that guy had gotten hit, 2 other guys got hit. So we lost 3 guys on that mission. And the guy that I tried to help was Ward Dodge, and he was basically my mentor when I showed up in the 357th Squadron. He's the one that taught me how to fly combat. And from that point forward, flak was the name of the game. And we had a lot of it, lost a lot of guys. In fact, the 105 community on the D model was a single seat version. We lost half the fleet of D models over there. And that just came to be part of the game, and you dealt with it. That's what you do. When we started flying, you got to remember it was a graduated process, and so the higher ups, I don't know whether this part of it was the military side or the civilian side, but they divided North Vietnam into what they call route packs, starting from the DMZ, which was the dividing point for South Vietnam and North Vietnam. They started working their way north. Route Pack 1 was right there north of the DMZ, then 2, then 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 was the entire Hanoi, Haiphong area. They further divided Route Pack 6, which was absolutely the worst place to fly, into A and B. The Air Force had A and the Navy had B. So ours was 6A missions, for instance. When we get a frag, the frag would be the orders for the next day. It would always have 3 targets: primary, secondary, and alternate. It was sort of funny, because we were starting to get frags that come down 6A, 6A, 6A. So no matter what you did, you weren't going to get an easy one out of it. You were going somewhere up in Hanoi. And so it was sort of a standing joke, really. Well, at least our alternate's 6A today. And because a lot of times you'd go up there and the weather would be bad, and you wouldn't necessarily get get a mission in if the weather was bad when you got up there, because we had to have VFR conditions. We didn't do IFR bombing, and so everything was visual. But Hanoi, Pack 6A, obviously, like I said earlier, that's where the guns, the missiles, the MiGs were operating.
Talking about that a little
No,
bit.
no, you want to get me mad, huh?
Well,
No, I'm just saying that this is one of the things that we had to deal with that was difficult to accept. everybody and their damn brother knew when the North Vietnamese had a bombing halt, all they were going to do is renew, rearm, and up the ante. They'd bring in more missiles. They would better disguise their gun sights. They would have opportunity for the MiG drivers to train more, because we basically had air superiority up there. They didn't have a chance to fly a whole lot when we were around. And they chose not to until basically August 23rd, 1967. That was the first time that they really came up and played during the time I was there now. I'm not speaking about before I got there. But they basically weren't able to come in come up and fight that much because they just were so outnumbered. But we had to live with these bombing halts, and fortunately, I will admit, I personally was not involved in a bombing halt. The bombing halts took place before and after my time there, so I personally wasn't one of those that could really throw up the anger from allowing them to build up while I was sitting on the ground waiting for them to finish building up, then be told to go back up there. But that's what would take place. And they took full advantage of increasing their defenses every single time. And it was stupid, absolute stupid. You know, anybody that has a brain of sense is, if you're going to go into combat, if you decide to go to war, then there's only one decision: kick ass and take names and get the hell out of there. Now, you got to give Bush credit for that. When we went over to Iraq, whatever the reasons were, we went in there in 6 days, it was done. It was a done deal. In our case, we couldn't even touch Haiphong Harbor. The ships would be sailing in and out of Haiphong Harbor. This is when I was there in '67. They'd be sailing in and out of that damn harbor, bringing in guns, missiles, fuel, you name it. We couldn't touch it. And all of our, quote, allies, the French and everybody else, were also sailing in and out of Haiphong Harbor. I say the French, I've been told that. I didn't see any French ships, but I have been told that they were coming in and out of there as well. And so I better back up on that statement. But they had total immunity. And our government would not even allow us to hit any of the ships. They wouldn't even blockade it and say, all right, guys, we're not going to destroy any of these ships, but you're not coming in there. You're not bringing the stuff in. They wouldn't even stop it. And that's where I have a hatred for Johnson and McNamara that will, the only day it will die is the day that I die. There I was, 40,000 feet, pulling 9 Gs, going to Mach 2, the 105. No, not quite. First of all, there is something I will add before I got to the MiGs, because the MiG situation actually occurred because of this thing I'm going to tell you about. I was down TDY, Takhli. I had 45 missions, and orders came in sending the 5 of us back to Yokota, and then there was another 5 going to come down to take our place at Takhli. That all made perfect sense to everybody, except for David B. Colonel Trays, who was my squadron commander at Nellis when I checked out in the F-105, had taken over a squadron at Korat, which was our sister F-105 wing. And he was the boss of the 44th Tactical Fighter Squadron. Well, I went down there to get my 100 mission patch. I think I mentioned that earlier. Well, I pick up the telephone and I call Colonel Trays. I say, hey, Colonel Trays, this is Dave Waldrop. Of course, we'd seen each other a lot because we had single runways at both Takhli and Korat. So sometimes somebody would blow a tire, foul the runway, and we'd have to divert, you know, them coming to Takhli, us going to Korat. So, I ran into Colonel Trays a couple of times. But anyway, so I told him, I said, this is David B. over here, or David B. Waldrop. I just said Dave Waldrop. And I said, they're sending, I'm down here TDY from Yokota, which, you knew about that. And I said, well, they're sending me home. I want to stay down here and get my 100. Do you need any experienced driver? I got 45 missions, 30 of them in Pack 6. And he said, get your fucking skinny ass over here, I'll take care of the paperwork. Now, you're going to have to edit that, but that's just what he said, and I'm not going to change it. And so I said, yes, sir. I packed my bags. Nobody had a clue what I had done. I didn't tell anybody because I didn't even think about it. He was going to take care of the paperwork. So, because they were giving us a leeway, a little bit of time, you know, between leaving Thailand and getting back to Yokota anyway. So I packed my bag and I hopped on a C-130 over about 100 miles to the east of me, and I landed, and I started flying the next day. And the only thing is, as I found out later, Colonel Trays hadn't taken care of the paperwork. So I'm over there without orders, just flying my ass off. And I mean, I started flying immediately because he had lost some guys, and then some guys had finished up and got their 100. So he was short-handed, especially experienced drivers. And when you, like I was mentioning earlier, our frags were starting to come down 666. So that's where we were going. And you don't want to take a brand new guy into Hanoi because, my gosh, anything in the world can happen. And the rest cap, if somebody gets shot down, knowing who to call, how to rest cap the guy, who to stay over him, who to go hit the tanker, and cycling. So there's a lot goes on a rest cap. And first of all, in the Hanoi area, generally, you're not even going to do a rest cap. That's the hard-hitting line on this whole thing is if you're in the Hanoi area, nobody's going to be able to come in and pick you up. If you can get out to sea, if you can get out to the west, to the mountains, to Laos or someplace like that, yeah, then we try to get you out of there. And I've been involved in a few of the rest caps myself. But that's why you didn't want a brand new guy just in the theater going downtown Hanoi, because there was a lot going on up there. I mean, you got to be flying your airplane. And so anyway, I immediately started flying and full tilt Hanoi as soon as I got to Korat. And then, of course, the first thing Colonel Drays did with my background, he made me a section leader, which is I could fly 3 and 4, lead for 3 and 4. As soon as I walked in the door, in fact, my very, very first mission was the first strike on the Demer Bridge. He put me as number 3. And then we got on the tanker, and lead, which was Major Bill Rate, I think it was, he couldn't take gas. And Major Rate said, Dave, you got more experience than anybody else in the flight. You got to lead. My very first flight at Korat, I led a flight downtown Hanoi. So that's a lot goes on when you're a lead. But anyway, what I'm saying is I was a section full-time. And so August 23rd was perhaps, and this will take a little bit of time to describe this because it really was the most involved and complicated mission that actually I flew in the Hanoi area. We were going against a big railroad yard, which is right across the Red River from Hanoi. Right across the northeast side of Hanoi was a railroad yard called Yen Vinh Railroad Yard. It's a big target, so we had our typical 4 flights of 105, a flight being 4 airplanes, for those of you that are not familiar with that. So a flight is 4 airplanes, so we had 4 flights of strike aircraft. They're all single-seaters, and so that's 16 airplanes. Then we had a flight of Weasel airplanes. They come in and snoop out the missiles, the radars, and that was a flight of 4. So we had 5 flights of 105s up there. Well, it was such a big target that the Air Force also attached 2 F-4 strike flights from U-Bahn of F-4s. And they got behind our flight. So we had 6 strike flights coming in on this target. Now we all come in pretty much together because we had what they call these LWIZIs, these devices that would help blank out the SAM missile radars. So we all came in together in a what they call a pod formation back then. Then Robin Olds, a flight of 4, was flying MiG cap to keep the MiGs off of us. And up to this point, like I think I mentioned earlier, there hadn't been any MiG activity to speak of. So we're heading up there, and we drop off the tanker, which you always, you refueled when you're on a PAC-SIS mission. You always refuel going in and coming off. So you got pretty proficient at refueling airplanes. You can do it almost in your sleep. And so whereas we're coming up there, we had some Snoopy airplanes out off the coast that had what we call them Big Eye, and they had radar coverage of North Vietnam, and especially Hanoi when we were going in. They started calling bandits, bullseye. That means MiGs taking off Hanoi, bullseye being Hanoi. MiGs are taking off in the Hanoi area. So I said, whoa, that's something different. And so they start tracking them, and we're coming in that afternoon from the west. Sometimes we'd come in from the ocean, the Gulf, and sometimes, most of the time we came in from land over on the Laos side. And we were coming over from Laos that day. So we came up, there's a big ridge called Thud Ridge, which basically ran southeast, northwest, and it ran toward Hanoi, and it almost pointed right at Hanoi. So we were going around the north side of that, and as we're starting to get our track, the call-outs for the MiGs and their position and their headings it was obvious. And by the way, this was an afternoon sortie. Where's the sun in the afternoon? It's in the west. It's in the lower part of the west. And what the MiGs were doing is they were going out to the west, then they were going to turn and come in out of the sun where we could not see them. Then that's that goes all the way back to the earliest combat airplanes, is you always try to come out of the sun if you're going to attack somebody. And that's what they were doing. They were MiG-21s, and so they came from the west, and so the force commander, I can't remember his name right now, who was leading the whole force in, he said, Robin, make sure you keep those guys off of us. And Robin says, we're working and we're trying to find them right now. Well, this is one of those cases where the MiGs won out and they came out of the sun. They were doing 1.2 Mach. Now that 1.2 Mach is 1.2 times the speed of sound. Speed of sound being 760 miles an hour at sea level. Now at altitude it's less, so they were probably doing close to, maybe 600, 700, 800 miles an hour. So they're moving on, and if you look at a MiG-21 head on, there's not much to see. It's a very, very small profile. The wings, the intake, it's not a lot of airplane if you're looking at it head on, so they're very, very difficult to see. And they did it right. I mean, these guys, they did it right. I gotta give them credit. They came in, they launched off 2 of their ATOLs. An ATOL is a heat-seeking missile, just like our Sidewinder. Same deal. And they knocked 2 F-4s down right behind my flight. Remember I said something about luck? And they were right behind my flight, and had they not been there, who knows? But they caught the brunt of the MiGs, and they knocked 2 of them down. And so now we got mayday calls, beepers. When you bail out of an airplane, or bail out, you don't bail out, you eject. When you eject out of an airplane, you got this beeper that goes off. It sort of makes it sound like a whoa, 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 whoa. And you can hear it over guard frequency, which everybody monitors. So we got all these beepers going off. We got mayday calls, you're on fire, get out of it, and all this stuff. All this crap's going on. We're still heading for the target. We ain't got there yet. And so Robin gets tied up trying to help these guys. And of course, you're not, like I mentioned earlier, there is no rest cap in the area we were now in. You just don't even, you're on your own. Because the helicopters, they can't get in there. It's just too heavily defended. So we press on. This is what you do. That's what you do. You don't sit there and just everybody say, oh, I'm going home. You keep on trucking, doing what your mission is. That's what we're paid to do. That's what we signed up for. And by the way, speaking of signing up for, every one of us flying fighters, we volunteered to fly fighters. And this was a big distinction between myself, ourselves, and the poor kids down in South Vietnam. They were drafted. They had no choice. They were sent over there to fight a political war, and they didn't have a choice about what they did. We all put our name on the line voluntarily. And I don't know why, that just was something I did want to bring out. There's two separate wars, two totally different wars. Our war was a air-to-air, air-to-ground war. It was a sterile war. We never saw faces. We never saw any blood and guts. We saw airplanes. We saw targets. Never saw a face. Those poor kids down there, different ball game. And I don't think anybody that's there, unless they've been through it, including myself, can never appreciate, what they were faced with. But getting back to my story. So we press on in. We're going into the target. And ours was the third flight. Because like I said, we were staggered at the back, and the flights are staggered like this. Lead would be here, second flight, third flight, fourth flight, like that. I don't know whether you get that on the camera, but otherwise, anyways. And that's why I said if the F-4s hadn't been behind me, then I would have been in line for the MiGs that came in, or my flight would have been. I might have been lucky, I don't know. But we get in the target area. We're the third flight in, and I now have, about 600 hours or so in fighters, and I'm going in, everything is set, you check your radar, your fire control system going in. You always line up on another airplane just to check, get everything, make sure everything's working properly. And the 105 had the most sophisticated fire control system of any fighter flying in North Vietnam, period. It had the latest and greatest, and it worked terrifically, as I described on the Dart. That was a good example of it. It works, especially if you know how to use it and you're smooth. And as I'm turning in, and we're at what's called a push-up point. That's when you leave the cruise mode, and now you throttle up, and you're picking up to about 550 for your roll in. That's 550 knots, about 650 miles an hour, or something like, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, I'm looking, you have what's called a reticle. It's projected up in front of you. And in our case, it's red rings with a dot in the middle. That's the pipper. The dot is the pipper, and you put that on your target. And so I'm just trucking along, everything's looking great, and all of a sudden, my reticle goes, and it's gone. And so I didn't think anything about it at the time, because we're about 15, 20 seconds from rolling. And the last thing in the world you're going to do is try to start screwing around with stuff and see if you can figure out how to get it back. And I didn't really know for sure what was wrong. And so I said, well, I've done this bombing mission plenty of times, so I can figure it out. I'll use the TLAR method. That looks about right. TLAR. And so I rolled in, and sure enough, I used my TLAR, and I released my bomb. So I'm coming off, and we had pre-briefed to turn hard to the north for our join up, because you always operate as a flight for mutual protection, especially when there's MiGs in the area. And there were MiG-17s all around the target, but none of them posed a threat to us, so we didn't fool with them. Our job was to bomb the railroad yard. But now I'm coming off, and I'm pulling about 6 Gs, coming off the target, doing about 600 or so knots, and I'm back out of burner because you want to save your gas. You don't want to, but I'm still doing 600 knots. 105's fast. That thing was just so beautifully fast. And I look up, though, as I'm making my turn to join up with the flight, and I see an F-105 heading west. He's got 2 MiG-17s right on his butt. The lead MiG is directly in trail with the 105. The second MiG was off to lead MiG's right side and staggered aft. And I saw that, and then I saw the fire coming out of the MiG's nose. He was shooting at the 105. And so I hollered out over the radio because I didn't have a clue who the 105 was. I just said, 105 heading west, you got 2 MiGs on your ass, do something. And he just kept on going. He probably didn't hear it, or he'd already switched over to a different frequency, which we normally did. We'd go to squadron common because there's so much chatter. If you're trying to join a flight up, it's really difficult with all that, because you can't talk over somebody else. So you'd switch immediately over to squadron common. So that's probably why he didn't hear me and I didn't hear him or whatever. And so then I made my decision. I had to go in and get these MiGs off his tail or he was going to be dead, or at least shot down. And so I hit what's called a panic button. There's a button over on the right side of the cockpit. And when you push this button, it cleans everything off the airplane except the outboard stations. And since I was flying number 3, I had a Sidewinder on my left station. Sidewinder, once again, is a heat-seeking missile that you can use in an air-to-air environment. And so I had that, and I pushed the nose over and lit the afterburner to accelerate as quick as I could. I went down, I lowered my nose so I could pick up speed as quick as I could, and also to go more, because it was almost like this, and I wanted to get more in trail. So I went low and down so I could come up below them so they couldn't see me coming. And that all worked. I mean, I got that down pretty good. And the last thing I saw, though, when I started my pull, I looked at my airspeed indicator and I was doing about 1.3 Mach. That's 1.3 times the speed of sound. I mean, I'm smoking. But for a good reason, because that MiG is still shooting at the 105. How he had missed him up to this point, I will never to this day know. Because he was dead trail. The 105 did not know he was there. He was just going straight and level. He was only doing about 400 knots because the MiG didn't even have his afterburner on. And the MiGs had afterburners if they needed the extra speed. He didn't even have it on it. So the guy was breaking all the rules. Number one, coming off the target, you got the throttle up, you're hauling ass, and you got the stick in your lap, and you're moving the airplane. We call it jinking. You constantly do this, and what you're doing is 2 things. If somebody is back there, you're killing their tracking solution, and number 2, you're looking for other MiGs, because also you are in charge of helping defend your own flight. So you want to see if there's a threat somewhere in your back, back that that's not in front of you. And so you're really looking hard. And so I came off that target. I was pulling 6.5 Gs, and doing this when I saw what was going on. So this guy's just going straight and level, the 105. So I come up, and my Sidewinder is on, and it's growling. Growling's audio means it's got to lock on to a heat signature. The heat is coming from the back of the airplane. That's where the engine exhaust comes out. So it's looking at a heat source. The lead MiG was so close to the 105, though, I didn't know whether the Sidewinder was looking at the 105 or whether it was looking at the MiG, which would have been great if I could discriminate, but I couldn't. And I didn't have my sight, damn it. And so I couldn't really, I didn't have all that working for me. And so I decided I could never live with myself if I had turned that Sidewinder loose and it had gone to the 105. I don't know what I would have done. I could never have accepted that ever. And so I turned the volume down on the missile, and I said, well, I got to go in with a gun. Well, remember earlier I was talking about that round thing with a pipper in the middle of it? Well, that's what you use if you're going in air-to-air wise to shoot at another airplane. So I didn't have that, but I said, well, I've shot the gun. It's somewhere out there, somewhere in the middle. And so I came up and I went after the second MiG first because I didn't want to go past him for the lead MiG, because then the second MiG would have a good shot at me. So I had to be smart and just try to bust these guys up. And so I went after the second MiG, and actually that's when I realized how fast I really was going. I'd seen my airspeed indicator, but I realized how slow they were going. That's a better way to put it. It's because all of a sudden I started seeing this closure, and I realized I am really closing fast. And so I opened up on the second trailing MiG, and I did a rake and I thought I saw flashes on his left wing. And now I'm pulling, I did about a 6 or 7 G pull vertical to stay behind these guys, because the 105 is not a turning airplane. So I had to really crank to stay behind him, which I did. And I go up through a broken layer of clouds, and I'm sitting up upside down, just floating there like this, literally upside down. And all of a sudden, underneath this broken layer of clouds, out comes this MiG-17. Now this one had his afterburner going. That's the difference. The other two did not have their burner going. So I don't know whether it was one of those guys, another guy, or if after I came through and I got them off this 105's tail, then they lit their afterburner to get some speed. That may be what happened. I'll never know. Nobody will know. But I saw that, and so I said, oh my gosh. And so I pulled down, and I mean, he did not know I was there. So he's just driving straight. And he's trying to get his speed up. Well, he's dealing with a speed demon when you're talking about a 105, because we were the fastest thing below 10,000 feet in flying. And so I came right down on top of him, and I opened up, and the first bullets went right through the cockpit. Then started working down the side of the airplane. And I did not realize this at the time, but while I'm actually hitting the MiG, a 105 actually came between myself and the MiG. He was slightly low, but apparently I'm hitting the MiG right as he passes directly between us. And a drop around must have hit one of his tanks, because a big ball of fire comes out from this 105. But all the 105s got home that day. That was the best part of this whole deal, because you don't really, in our world up there, our environment, you really don't have a chance to ever save somebody else's life, because of the opportunities. I mean, when you're dealing with flak and SAMs, there's nothing you can do. You can't go over there and help a guy with his airplane. You know, it's his ride, and there's nothing you can do to help him. So if you get hit by MiG or by flak or SAMs, then you're on your own. But in this particular case, I was able to get there, clean these MiGs off this guy's tail, and every 105 got home that day. And the only thing is, and this may be hard for some people to comprehend, considering the hostilities and the environment that we were operating in, we still had a code of ethics. There's probably a better choice of words. I don't have it at my grasp right now. But if I had had the sight that was working, and since he didn't know I was there, I would have probably gone for his engine or one of his wings. I would not have gone for him personally. And in fact, when I got back to Korat, the first thing everybody's seen the movie Top Gun. And you know, when the guys land on the carrier deck, everybody's around them, you know. Well, actually, I have a picture of that, and that same thing happened to me. But the first thing everybody asked, did he get out? And I had to say no, he didn't get out, because everybody respected the fact that he was another kid or guy who was doing what he loved to do, and he was, in his own way, protecting his country. So he wasn't like, it wasn't personal to me. But so I would have not gone for the cockpit. But I didn't have the sight, so you know, I had no choice. I did what I had to do, and I wouldn't change anything, but I regret that the guy didn't get out. The epitome in combat for any fighter pilot is to take an opportunity to engage an enemy airplane, in our case a MiG, and to actually accomplish the task of shooting it down. I mean, it sort of puts you into another group. And no, there weren't that many. Now, and I do want to say this. There were 2 MiGs. When I got back to Korat, I claimed a kill. I knew I had this guy. I didn't know whether I got the first guy or not. And to this day, and I'm just, for the record, I've said this before, I don't know for sure what took place. But what did take place is, and the reason the wing gave me credit for 2, and the official Air Force record is only 1, but all they had to go on was film documentation, I guess. But that night, I'm going to have to really doctor this up, because the actual language that took place, I don't think I can quite, maybe I can bleep it. That night, we're getting ready to do our mass debrief. The mass debrief, when you go to Hanoi, when you come back, all the flights get together in one room. Force commander stands up in front of all of us. We're all in the room, and the intelligence officers in there, the wing commander, the vice wing commander, everybody, you know, a lot of squadron commanders would come in because they want to know what took place if they weren't on the mission, because not everybody is on every mission. And so this was a big one, though. And so the room was pretty full. So the force commander's up there getting ready to start, and he starts talking about some of the stuff that took place. Well, the sergeant comes in, and we're down at where all the intelligence people were also located, and I think they were in the same building. But anyway, the sergeant comes in, and I think that our intelligence officer was a major, and he said, "Major Umpty-Up, we got a call from U-Bahn." And so this guy says, "Could you hold the brief till I get back?" So we'd all just sort of milling around, standing around talking. And so pretty soon he comes in. He had this funny look on his face. He said, "Lieutenant Waldrop, no, what? You claim you got 1 MiG?" I said, "Yes, sir. That's what I claimed. I got 1 MiG. I know it because I saw him hit the ground." Well, that was Colonel Oles, and he just called, and he wanted to speak to me, and when I got on the phone, he said, "Who is this?" And I identified myself as Major Umptium, and he said, "Well, this is Colonel Oles over to U-Bahn, and I want to confirm a kill for one of your guys over there flying Thuds." It was, and it's in that letter. He said it absolutely was the most spectacular thing he had seen in that whole tour he had over there. A little while later, I got a letter from Robin, and because they were going to have the review board, and one of the guys that was on it, in fact it was Bob White, actually told me about the review board coming up. He said, "If you got any kind of documentation, you might want to try to get it down there, because all they got to go on is just strictly right now the film, so forth." Anyway, so I contacted Colonel Oles then, and so he wrote me this letter, and it says, "Dear Lieutenant Waldrop, here's my observation. Based on vivid recollection, passed it on to the 7th Air Force, and they were the ones that were going to do the review and so forth. And finally, let me know." And he said, "If that doesn't work, let me know and I'll redo this." So anyway, he said, "As far as I'm concerned, you got the first MiG without any shadow of a doubt. As to the second, the film showed hits. What happened after that will require confirmation by you and anyone else in 388 that saw it or saw a shoot," which of course, like I said, nobody else saw the engagement except Robin, and the man didn't get out of the airplane. And remember, I saw no shoot connected with that first MiG. None of our troops went down in the vicinity that date, so if anyone saw a shoot north or northwest of Phu Quyen, it had to be your second MiG. And may I say in passing, and this is the neat part, may I say in passing that the sight of your Thud hot on the tail of a MiG-17 shooting like hell and scoring hits was one of the most thrilling sights in my whole tour. You look like a shark after a minnow." By the way, after that, I wound up with a call sign. It was Shark, and I still get called Shark today. Shark after a minute.
I couldn't help shouting at you, "Go get them, Thud, breach of radio discipline," I know, but it was a beautiful moment. All the best to you and good luck with the claims board. And it says, "Hell, we fighter jocks know you did it. Never fear and have fun in the F4." Because I was telling him that since we lost our Thuds at Yokota, that we were going to pick up F4. So that's where he was coming from on that. It's not a bad bird at that. Robin Owens. I know he did not want to leave. In fact, I remember talking to him after I got to know him, and he said, "You know, I didn't really want to get my 5th kill because they would have pulled me, and I still had work to do." That's exactly the words he used. He said I still had work to do. He was the real deal. I mean, he was probably, and I will take nothing away from our leadership because we were lucky. God, I flew with some of the greatest leadership and commanders, and I think about the leadership we got in this country today up in Washington, and I think about the difference between those guys and the real deal, the guys that were leading us, that were actually feet on the ground with us. And when that's not really true, feet in the air. Those guys were the real deal as far as leadership. The guys, bozos in Washington, they don't have a clue. But he was probably, in really getting to know Robin after the fact, knowing about him through his peers, the people that actually flew with him, that were with him at Ubon, he was probably the finest combat commander that the Air Force has ever had. I think I could go out on a limb and say that, because not only was he the epitome of a jock, a fighter jock, he was a leader. When he walked in the room, there was no doubt who was in charge. You knew immediately who was in charge. And for those guys that got to fly with him, when he was in charge, they had that warm, fuzzy feeling. This guy knows what he's doing and he's going to take care of us. Like if he hadn't just been where he was, nobody else in my flight even saw me tangle up with him. I was solo as far as everybody in the nobody in the 105 community even saw what took place. He just happened to see it. So it's not something that and it happens so fast. These engagements don't last. I mean, in the movies you see these games where they just go, "Oh, this is not." It doesn't work like that. Not in our environment with the fighters and the speeds that we were dealing with. Because first of all, normally anybody that would have had any sense would have boogied out of there. But in my case, for some stupid reason, I was hanging upside down. I was looking around, don't get me wrong, I was still clearing my 6. But I was just happened to be upside down when I saw this other MiG. Normally, the environment we were operating in, you're not going to hang around. That's not very good for your health. And so that just happened. I don't know of a single other confirmation by some other pilot, really. I'm sure it may have taken place. I'm just saying, I don't know of any. And but it was special because I did get to know Robin through an organization called Red River Valley Fighter Pilots Association. The very first one I attended when it was back in the States. It was at Wichita, Kansas, at McConnell. And one of the guys asked, knew of that deal, and he said, "Have you ever met Robin?" I said, "No, is he here?" And he said, "Yeah, let me go introduce you to him." So I met him, and I mean, it was great. It was just awesome. He was a bigger than life guy, and I mean, he just lit up like a Christmas tree. So you're the guy. He stuck out his big paw, and it was cool. And, but anyway, I got to talk to him several times, and then I got to know him through some friends of mine as well. And so, but he was really a super guy. I think he's probably the only guy that ever took on the President of the United States. Well, on October 28th, just to make sure that there wasn't anything that flying in a combat environment might have to offer, we took off on an early mission. We were going downtown Hanoi. I mean, as in 2 miles southeast of Hanoi on a target. And we took off before sunrise. The sun started coming up right as we were flying. We were heading to the east, so that means in a fighter, you're flying formation. Remember, and it's you know, you got lead, 3, 4, 2. It's like that, and you're flying sort of a loose formation. You're not flying tight, so you just relax. But the sun's in your eyes. Well, when the sun's in your eyes, you really can't see any lights in your cockpit. And as the wingman, which I was flying off the lead because I was flying number 3, you know, I'm looking over there. I'm not looking at anything in my cockpit anyway. And so finally we get ready to turn south to join up with a tanker. Well, when we turn south, all of a sudden I see this master caution light on in the cockpit. And I said, where'd that come from? And so in the 105, you had the master caution light and you had a warning light. Well, this was a master caution. But then it takes you over to a panel that has a series of system lights. And one was lit up and it said oil quantity. Well, when you take off, you're always above a half, more like 3/4 to full on the oil quantity. Mine was at a half because the light was on, it said oil quantity. Well, we have a gauge as well, so there's a lot of redundancy there. And so I looked down at my gauge and sure enough, it's at half. And so I called that out to lead and I said, I've got a master caution, it's saying oil quantity and I'm sitting on a half right now. And he said, well, keep an eye on it. If it drops, get out of here and try to get to Udorn, which was the closest base at the time. And sure enough, I saw it and it was just creeping down. So I told him, I said, hey, this thing I'm losing this oil. And he said, hey, head for Udorn and take 4 with you as a chase. So we peel out to head off to Udorn, which is about 30 miles away. Well, I was loaded down. Of course, I still had fuel in my tanks, still had a load of bombs, and it was still dark down below us. And so I could see a bunch of little lights from the villages and everything, and I didn't want to get rid of that stuff, and I needed to get rid of it because it's drag. I wanted to be able to stretch the range as much as I could on that airplane in case I lost my oil. And so there was a range of mountains that I told number 4, I said, I'm gonna head over here so I can get rid of this ordnance over these mountains, try to stretch my range a little bit. So I started turning, and it's like, all of a sudden I started feeling this, you probably can't see it on the film, but I'm shaking my hand and there's this vibration just started setting in on the airplane. By this time the oil quantity had completely dropped out to 0. So I had no more oil left. And normally the procedure is set the throttle at about 87% and you don't leave it. And that's where they say you're going to get the best range out of the engine when you lose your oil. So I'm going over this mountain range trying to get where I can punch all this ordnance and crap off the airplane. And about halfway around there, the vibration it's just like you took a volume knob and just slowly turned it up. And the vibration kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And so I called out to number 4 that's chased me. I said, the vibration is really picking up in this thing. And he said, yeah, you're smoking pretty good too. And I said, I don't know for sure I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna try to get over these mountains though, with this airplane. And it finally I got around to where I was over the mountains and I was gonna punch the stuff off. The vibration had gotten so violent that I was literally, as strong as the 105 was, and it was a really, really well-built strong, it probably took more battle damage, flak and stuff than any airplane flying. And I knew it was a strong airplane, but I couldn't read a single instrument in the cockpit. I mean, it was just a blur. Everything was a blur. And I said, this thing, I'm losing. I'm probably going to get out of it. And he said, well, I don't doubt that. You ought to see the back of your airplane. It's like 4th of July is coming early. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you ought to see the shit flying out of the back of your airplane. And so I said, yeah, that's it. I said, I popped the rat. A rat is a ram air turbine. It's a little propeller that falls out once you turn it loose. It falls out of the side of the airplane. It's got a propeller that starts spinning up, and that will provide you with a generator so you continue to communicate, as well as it'll provide hydraulic pressure to run your flight controls if you lose your engine, because your engine is run from a hydraulic pump, or the hydraulic pump is run from the engine, and that's what provides the pressure for the flight controls. So anyway, that allowed me to talk and to fly the airplane. So I said, I'm shutting this damn thing down before it comes apart. And I did. I stop cocked it. Now I'm in the world's biggest, heaviest glider. And a glider in the 105 is like a rock falling. So you're not going to go very far. And so he said, well, make sure you get out plenty of time. I said, I'm going to get out about 10,000. And so sure enough, went down, pulled that handle up, pulled that trigger, and wow. And it squeezed the thing, and that rocket, well, the rocket doesn't fire at first. It was a shell that initially sends you up the track. It's got a cable that's actually attached to the rocket, because if the rocket fires, it could burn your feet and your legs and stuff. So anyway, went up, that thing went off, and what a ride that was. And I've still got neck and back issues to this day from that, as a matter of fact. But you know, everything worked. I floated my parachute. I landed at a big old tree, I think one of the biggest trees in Thailand, or at least the tallest. And I'm up here and I'm looking around, and we got one of these rappelling devices, and I started to use that thing, and I said, damn, I'm not sure that'll reach the ground. And of course, as a kid, I used to climb trees like every other kid did. So I said, you know, up there, naturally, the tree wasn't that big. So I pulled myself, I could pull myself over this branch to this tree. I climb out, I turn loose my parachute, and I start climbing down this damn tree. And I get down the last part of it, probably about the last 6 or 8 feet of the tree. It's so damn big, I got my arms spread as wide as I could, and I don't have any grip anymore. I'm sliding down. The only scratch I got were my forearms where I slid down this damn tree. And anyway, number 4, he got the helicopter. They came in, picked me up, and took me back to Udorn, and then I hopped on another flight back to Korat. They check you over, and the doctor, you know, goes over everything, asks you how you doing, all this kind of stuff. And so anyway, they take me back to Korat, and oh, I forgot to mention something earlier. Remember me talking about, because this came into play, about not having orders sending me to Korat? Well, Yokota found out where I was on August 23rd. I had been missing since about the 12th of August when I went from Takhli to Korat. And then, of course, all the news media splattered that all over everything. That's when they found out that I'd gone to Korat. Well, what else didn't follow me to Korat was my medical records. And so I never even have, even to this day, there's nothing documented in any of my paperwork that I ejected from an airplane. The official Air Force records, at least. And funny thing was, I never thought a thing about it till about, 5 or 6 years ago. I was at a river rat reunion and got to talking to one of the guys I was down there with, Dick Gow. And somehow or another that thing came up, and he said, by the way, Lieutenant, I got a question to ask you. That's what he always calls me, because he was a captain and I was a lieutenant. And he said, I want to know something. Since when do lieutenants write their own orders? And I looked at him and I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. It just didn't register. What are you talking about, Dick? He said, remember when you went to Korat? I said, yeah. He said, how did you write your own orders? I said, I didn't. I picked up the telephone, I called Colonel Trays. And he said, come on over, and I did. And he said, do you realize that you just changed official orders by doing that? And I had never thought a thing about that up to that point in time and space. And I did. I guess I did something that I wrote my own orders over there. Because Colonel Trays never got any orders made up for me. Oh well, you know. But you know, it was a hell of an experience. It was a hell of an experience. Working with the people I worked with is something I will never ever fail to remember and cherish. These people, these guys, just like the guys in South Vietnam, all of us knew it could be our day. that something wasn't going to go our way. But yet everybody put their boots on, everybody put their helmet on, they strapped that big beast on, started up, and away we went. And we did our job. And it was frustrating as hell dealing with the leadership that we had that wouldn't support us, that wouldn't allow us to win the war, which we could have done in a damn heartbeat. That leadership would not allow us to do it. Now I'm going to want to go one step further here. I also fault the JCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because every single one of those guys should have gone on and written their careers off, and they should have resigned en masse and say, President, we can no longer work for you and the way that you're running this war and squandering our resources and our kids. And I mean, I hold them responsible for not having the guts to stand up and say, that's it, we can't support you. If that had happened, that whole thing would have changed immediately. I mean, the whole picture would have changed, because the president could no longer conduct what he was doing, the way he was doing it, had they done that en masse, said, sir, with all due respect, we can no longer perform our jobs.
I grew up in Bremen, Georgia, about an hour west of here. Graduated from high school there. Came to Georgia Tech 1952. Met Pat Epps along the way. We graduated in 1956. I had been accepted for pilot training with the Air Force after ROTC, but it was delayed for a year on that to go on active duty. So I worked for Lockheed out here in Marietta. And then in 1957, I entered pilot training down in Bainbridge, Georgia. I was very fortunate, flew the first group that flew the T-37. Went from there to Laredo, Texas, T-33, and got my wings. Came back to Moody Air Force Base flying F-86Ls.
What put you on a track to go into ROTC and then into the Air Force? Is that something you wanted to do since you were a kid, or when did that kick in for you?
Well, growing up during World War II, formative years, I heard about these guys flying Tigers running around China, strafing trains and doing things in the big raids. And I thought that must be really neat. But I never thought I'd get a chance at it until I got to Tech and found out there was ROTC and that I could have a chance.
And what made you choose Tech?
Probably because of the football team right then. Plus, my next door neighbor was a ham radio operator, and he convinced me that if I went to Tech and got an electrical engineering degree, my future was secure.
At what point in your Air Force career did you get introduced to the F-105?
I was in graduate school at Southern California in 1965-66. And while I was there, I was thinking I'm going to miss out on this war because I had a lot of friends that already had assignments. But I received an assignment at the time before I finished out there for the 105. And the sequence of events was I'd go to survival school at the completion and then to Nellis Air Force Base and check out in the 105 to go to Takhli, Thailand.
So when you were at Nellis, how often did you get into Las Vegas?
Surprisingly, I didn't go down there as much as you'd think during that time. We were pretty busy. I went out a few times to make sure I wasn't going to win any extra money.
Tell me as much as you can remember about your journey to Vietnam. How did they get you over there? Did you fly an airplane over there, or did they ship you some other way? Just tell us about going to Vietnam and your first impressions of being there.
Okay. I left from Fort Walton Beach, Eglin Air Force Base in the end of March 1967. I flew commercially to San Francisco and then up to Travis Air Force Base, where I was on a military contract flight that island hopped to the Philippines, Clark Air Base, and I went through jungle survival school there for about 10 days. And then I flew again on a contract flight to Bangkok, and then on a military airplane, C-47, the old Goonie bird, up to Takhli.
And what do you remember about stepping off an airplane for the first time? And
I had a very memorable introduction. The fellow who was the ops officer for my squadron and the one who became my flight commander subsequently said, "Welcome to the 354th, the highest loss rate squadron in Southeast Asia." Yeah, what a good deal. And about a week later, I went up and met with the wing commander who welcomed the new people. And he told us that in 2 years of operation, the track record was in the 100 missions or 1 year tour, you had a 50-50 chance of being shot down. If you were shot down, you had a 50-50 chance of being rescued. Welcome to the war.
You know, most pilots are in love with the airplane that they flew, but some of those loss rates had to do with the airplane you were flying, correct?
The loss rate, I think, was primarily the mission. But backing up, when I was in graduate school and we knew people were getting assignments, I had volunteered or indicated an interest in every airplane in Southeast Asia except the F-105. And that was based on a briefing from Colonel Yeager when he was head of the test pilot school. He described it as an electronic monster. Can't understand why the Air Force wasted their money on this thing. So I was not particularly happy when I got my assignment. But by the time I checked out in the airplane and started flying it, I started to really like it. By the time I left to go to war, I won't say I was in love with it, but I was proud I was flying it. And the more I flew it, the prouder I was. But our mission, since we only flew in North Vietnam, made us extremely vulnerable. We didn't have much, milk runs. Maybe on a bad weather day, you'd do a recce down in Route Pack 1 north of the DMZ. And that was pretty easy, but I was on my 47th mission and 31 of them were in the Hanoi area. I'd already beaten the odds 2 or 3 times. I never got to meet Colonel Oles, but he was the commander of the 8th Wing over at Ubon when I was flying, and they flew MiG-Cap on several missions into Hanoi that I was on. But I did not meet him personally until after the war.
So, obviously your missions were into dangerous territory, and I've read that, well, I won't get into reasons, but because of our unwillingness to stop the stuff coming in from the Russians, they had a very robust anti-aircraft defense system. So I imagine every mission was just tremendously high risk.
There were a few missions like when we would do road recce or just general reconnaissance missions down in the lower route packs 1, 2, or 3 that were you almost say were fun. Get out and roam around and see the countryside while you were doing it. But yes, when we went into the Hanoi area, the expression was when you got up there, your ass belongs to Uncle Sam, put those bums on target. And there were some missions that everything is there. We went in, at the time I was there, we'd make run-ins at low altitude around 1,500, 2,000 feet to try to stay out of the radar for the sounds and the radar guns. Therefore, small arms fire was a risk that you had to avoid. But yeah, in the pattern that we flew, we'd pull up to about 14,000 feet and then come back in on a dive. And that's when the radar could pick you up. Where the first month or so I was there, where the MiGs would be laying for us right over Hanoi. And one mission I was on, we had MiGs going up with us in the pop. You had 105s and MiGs and 105s and MiGs, and SAMs going off and flak all around. I don't know who the MiG leader was that day, but he wasn't too smart. Oh, you could almost watch a gauge drop. I used to laugh. Said, put your hand on the floorboards, you could feel it going by. I'm trying to think. Typical fuel consumption was probably about 3,000 gallons or pounds an hour. The afterburner jumped to a little over 6,000.
So you didn't do that unless you meant it.
No. The best I did, I guess I got it about 1.3 or 4. But that's an interesting story if you want to put on.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd love to hear it.
We were on a mission on Sunday afternoon in a railroad yard just northeast of Hanoi across the Red River Bridge there. And my flight leader, we were the #1 bomb flight, and there was a flak suppression flight ahead of us, and the #4 guy there had been hit and was going down under the clouds. We had about a 2,000 foot level layer. And so my flight leader says, I'm going to follow him down. So that meant me leading the mission out. And about the time I got out and got to recover right across Hanoi, and that's where we were in afterburner, accelerating out of there and jinking. A SAM went off so close that I flew through the colored cloud, which only lasted a couple of seconds. And I came back and I told him that day, I said, I think the biggest damage I did was going across Hanoi supersonic, blowing out all the windows in town. But as we got out, I was starting to climb out, and a fellow from up here in Georgia who happened to be in my squadron too, I recognized his voice, called me and he says, single 105, 18 east of 97, shake it, you got a MiG on you. So I did a split S right down through the cloud layer, pulled up, and when I did and looked out, there was a mountain ridge on either side of me out here, at least 500 feet higher than me. And I came back out of there rather subdued, to say the least. And I remember I got back and went through debriefing. And intelligence at that time, if you had a tough mission, they'd pull out this bottle of bourbon, old Overholzer, I remember, and they'd give you a shot. And I threw that one down, and I started telling him about the mission. He pulled us, so you like another? And I said, yeah. And I says, can I have another one? I had my third shot of bourbon. We got through the debrief, and I looked at my watch. It was about 5 minutes till evening church time. And I went down to the chapel. I knew this Methodist minister was down there, and I leaned up and right up in his face. I said, it was a close one today, but he got me back here. I said, you think I'll be okay here? He says, you'll be glad you're here. Come on in. But that was probably my most exciting day, other than being shot down.
I guess a day you probably don't enjoy talking about, but I hope you will, July 5th, 1967. And maybe, you know, I'd love for people who, particularly young people, to understand what your day was like. Not just the fact that you were shot down, but your usual day and preparing for a mission. And all you can remember about that day would be wonderful.
I don't have any trouble talking about it. July the 5th, 1967 was obviously a very special day. And 2 or 3 things led up to that, in that I had just been appointed or signed as the executive officer of the squadron, and we were having an inspection. We had a new commander. He asked me to do a check around to make sure we were ready and get acquainted myself. So I had not flown for 3 days. I had sat as spare when they needed, but I didn't get off. And I remember on the night of the 4th of July, I wrote a letter home, and I said, well, I missed the fireworks again today, but Fergie promised me tomorrow for sure. And sure enough, I went out on the afternoon mission. I dropped that report off on the commander's desk and headed out. And later on, talking to people in Hanoi when we were together, almost without exception, all of us acknowledged there was something different about the way we felt that day. We couldn't put our finger on it, but it wasn't like a normal day. And I kept trying to think the whole time, what have I forgotten? What did I do or not do, or what? And as it turns out, obviously it was that sense, I guess, of the impending, what was imminent. But in my case, I was the number 4 airplane in a second flight on a railroad siding right up near the Chinese border. And just as we started our roll-in of the first flight, there was a call for MiGs about 20 miles west of us at our altitude. So as number 4, that's part of my responsibility. So I took a quick look out there to see if I could pick them up. And I didn't see anything, but when I looked back, my leader had already started rolling in, and the flak was so thick that I couldn't see down. So I had to stay up till some bombs went off and I could see the target. Consequently, I had to adjust my roll-in. Instead of being in a 45-degree dive, I was probably at least 60 coming straight down, and I had to adjust the altitude, drop the bombs. And I flew through 3 levels. They were laying out flak at level 3, about 3,000 feet apart. I made it through the 3 of the levels of flak. But just as my bombs came off, I felt a hit. I'd been hit twice before, so it was unmistakable. But this time, my procedure was, when I dropped the bombs, was hit the afterburner, pull out, let that give me the thrust, and start my jinking. Well, when I hit the afterburner, the airplane just did a tumble. And I came back out, it stabilized, and I remember this distinctly. Boy, that'd be a heck of a ride at Coney Island. I'd never been there, but I'd heard about it. So I relaxed, put the burner back in, get out of here, and the airplane just started flipping and tumbling. And I couldn't see out because of the flames, but I was still going to try to make it as close as I could to the water. We'd come in off the Gulf, and we're going back out that way. But about that time, the camera up in front of the dash, under the windscreen, broke loose, and I had to duck as it went over my head. And as I was looking, the SBOT panel just started crumbling, and the airplane was starting to come apart. So I leaned back, put myself in position, pulled the handles, and I remember thinking nothing happened. And boom, it's gone. And I had a very interesting experience in that I grayed out. I couldn't see anything, didn't feel anything. I was just kind of floating. I thought I was dead, literally. And then I started feeling some pressure, and my vision started coming back, and I could see a little bit of green. And then all of a sudden I could see the canopy of, the tops of the trees, and I'm coming down. And I looked up to see if the canopy was open, and it was just starting to blossom. And I reached up to get it, and when I put my hands on the risers, they collapsed. I was sitting on a log on the ground. And that all took less than 2 seconds, because had those automatic systems that got me out, pull to shoot, not worked, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. I figure I went out inverted in negative G's and probably maybe even ejected toward the ground. I don't know. No idea. But somebody up there was looking out for me that day again, like the day that over Hanoi supersonic.
You're not any place you want to be.
Well, the first thing, obviously, that I did once I was on the ground, sitting on the log, my emergency beeper was going off. Get that off so I can talk. But I couldn't get up to it. I couldn't get it cut off. I didn't think. I realized after the fact that I had, because 2 others had been shot down, and their beepers were the ones that were going off, blocking things. But I made an immediate call. Told them I was down safe. I'd check in an hour. That's really optimistic. But sitting on the log looking down was kind of ironic. I looked down and looked at the tree. This is just like North Georgia. Those hills, same kind of scrub trees and pine tree and running around the ground, gravelly. Then all of a sudden it dawned on me, these ain't going to be friendly North Georgia mountaineers. Everybody I see now may be looking to kill me. So I started trying to get rid of stuff. My chute was caught in the trees. I couldn't get it down. My survival kit that comes out separately had banged down, and I couldn't get it open. But I could get the side open that had the jungle hat with a mosquito net and a bottle, 2 cans of water. And I pulled out the water, stuck them in my flight suit, put the hat on, threw my helmet down the hill, hoping that would make them think I'd gone that way. And I started up the hill, which was the instructions or recommendations from survival school. And as I got to almost to the top of the hill, and I could see a path out here that I was going to go to it, I hesitated just long enough. I think actually my G-suit got caught in some brambles and kept me from pushing these bushes open. And a Vietnamese ran across closer than 4 feet away. The only thing, he was in a hurry or didn't look my way. So that caused me to look around a little bit and the path, and then I saw these field wires across the way. When I leaned up and looked, I'd come down right in the gun ring. There was a gun sight down here about 100 yards and another one over here about 100, 150. And so I reconsidered my actions at this point, don't get too carried away. But I managed to get across that path without leaving a track with the boots. And I thought if I got over on the other side and down the hill, I could hide out for that hour and check in and maybe get picked up, get out of here. And I didn't realize when I got across, all the brush was over here. I was in grass, maybe a foot, foot and a half high. And when I got to the edge and looked down, it was a drop off into a bog. I wasn't going anywhere in that direction. So I sat down and opened one of the cans of water, and at that point I was so thirsty I didn't think there was enough water around. I took 2 sips and I thought it was going to come out my ears, all the psychological, the shock effects. But I managed to drink it, forced it down, threw the can away, and about that time I heard voices that were gathering up over here along the trail. And they were pointing and talking, and I'd heard some shots and hollering back and forth. They'd obviously found my parachute and helmet. And so they'd eliminated that side. They just really were going to come over here. And they did, and they came out. And I did this and tried to get anything white out of sight and hide down. But it turned out I wasn't going to hide under anything. They walked up and tapped me on the shoulder and welcomed me to North Vietnam. The ones that came out and got me were actually militia. They were in civilian clothes. One of them had a rifle.
I don't mean to interrupt, but these are regular North Vietnamese.
No, these civilian. They're like militia.
Oh, okay.
They're in civilian clothes. I don't know how they fit into the system right there then, but like I say, one of them had a rifle, and they started stripping me down. And of course, when I got my pistol out over here, one of them pulls it out and looks at it. And I don't know why, it was just a sixth sense. I just happened to glance up just as he was starting to come across and hit me in the head, and I ducked and missed him. And the guy with the rifle leaned across and hit him with a butt in his chest to knock him back. And I remember thinking, you and I are going to be friends. I don't know about the others, but I like you. But they packed me down. Well, they started me, took off my boots, stripped out everything out of the flight suit. One amusing thing, I carried a half a pack of Salems because we'd been told that Ho Chi Minh liked those, and if Ho Chi Minh did, most everybody else probably would. And I carried some Winston cigarettes too. They pulled the cigarettes out, looked at them, crumbled them up, and threw them away. And I said, well, so much for intelligence. But they started walking me, and I realized if I walked very far barefooted, my feet were not going to be in a condition to do anything else. So as we started down the trail, I started watching, and I saw a root coming up, and I hooked my foot in it and fell over and convinced them that I'd hurt myself. And I got them to carry me all the way down the side of the mountain. And we stopped in a little village. They put me in a house in the back corner on a bed. And I was there, I'd say, between 30 minutes and an hour, and he came in, tapped out, and walked back out. And I got in this, I called it a safari wagon. It was bigger than a Jeep, but not as big as you see safaris nowadays, but open vehicle with a canvas top. And they put me in the back seat, one guy on each side. They're holding my arms like this, so I wasn't tied up. But I looked up as the fellow on my left in English said, "You're now the prisoner of the Chinese Liberation Army." And what I saw in front was a picture of Mao Zedong and Lin Pao, head of the premier and the head of the People's Army. And I couldn't put my hand up and do the Marine salute, but I said something, well, okay, you really did it to yourself this time. Because I figured I was gone to China because we were that close to the border. I learned over the next 24 hours that that's why the gun sights were so good down there. The Chinese were running them all. And what we had rolled in over, literally, that got us was what we considered probably the best gun sight in North Vietnam. Of course, now I knew why. And later, in '79, when Deng Xiaoping came to this country, he acknowledged that they had 300,000 regular troops in North Vietnam for the war. So that's what they were doing. And it was also why we had been briefed about 2 or 3 weeks before that there would be no attempted rescues in the buffer zone right up near the border. That they finally acknowledged that those were the Chinese. And I'd have to say that overall, I was well treated with them. They brought me something to eat. They wanted me to do a radio broadcast, which I declined with no pressure. And that night, the commandant came in. They introduced him as the commandant. And through the translator said that if I cooperated with them, that I would be treated well and I'd be taken to Beijing and be treated well. And I declined that kind offer also, because in 1967, Beijing and the moon were about the same distance from Atlanta, Georgia, as far as I was concerned. I did not know, I should say, that we had an F-104 pilot that had been shot down in September of '65 who was already in Beijing. And he came home when we did, and I introduced myself to him and told him my opportunity to meet him. He said, "You made a good choice." He spent 7.5 years in solitaire. And after during the 24 hours with the Chinese, when I knew, they took me around the next day to various gun sites. We'd stop someplace, and about 8 or 10 guys would come out in uniform and line up. And I called him the cheerleader. The head guy would get out his little red book, and he'd read and chant and read, and he'd chant. And the translator then would say, "The U.S. will surely be defeated. The Vietnamese people will surely be victorious." Okay, that's nice. And one thing out of that, which really surprised me, was that almost every one of these guys had a camera. And when the chanting and cheerleading was all over, they'd all came around. They're all making pictures. So I had my fingers crossed that somebody was going to make a picture to get out, because I knew with my close call I was probably going to be reported as killed in action. So I cooperated with the picture making at that point as much as possible. But that afternoon, they took me up to a place, I guess it was either a subordinate or a corresponding headquarters, where I met some more regular Army. And I had, I guess you'd say, a test of wills. They started the chanting again, and this time they wanted me to say it. And I told them, "No, I'm not going to say that." And one of the guys, I don't know what they smoked, but his eyes showed he had something more than issue, maybe even old Overholzer. But he comes up with his rifle and puts the bayonet right under my chin and pops it up like that, while the translator's right here saying, "You must say it." And I wouldn't shake my head. I just did kind of like that. And after 2 or 3 times like that, and for him saying, "You must say it," I finally just did my lips tightly and grimmed, so I'm not going to say that. And an officer obviously came up and got this guy to back off with a rifle. But I wasn't too sure there for a while, because I could see the rifle bore was clean. It was operable. But once that was over, back in the truck, back down to where I'd been before, in an area with a cave. That was my house right then. And they let me take a nap, and the commander came by and motioned like that, and went out and got in the truck. and went down. They turned me over to the North Vietnamese. And I remember when I made that offer and to go to Beijing, I said, no, I wanted to go to Hanoi. The guy looked at me and just kind of shook his head. So when he turned me over, I leaned her back out and I wanted to shake hands with him, and we did, which is part of the story because I hope to meet him later on. But anyway, the Vietnamese took me, blindfolded me, and took me down, I'm pretty confident, to Kelp Airfield. And I got a jet helicopter ride into Gia Lam, right downtown, and then a truck ride across the river to the big prison, Waldrop. We referred to Waldrop as the Hanoi Hilton,
Oh, that's the
but
Hanoi Hilton.
but also
Yeah.
Hanoi Hilton tends to encompass all the camps. If you were in Hanoi, you were in the Hilton, although everybody, with few exceptions, processed through the big prison initially. And I went in the new guy village there, learned I wasn't nearly as big and mean and tough and strong as I thought I was. A couple of little fellas with a rope can get you to do and say things that you didn't plan to. And another one that got my arms up behind me for the better part of a day, convinced me to do some things. It had been opened in, I think, summer, June, July area, '66. And they called it the farm because out the edge of town, and you could hear the chickens and the animals and things around, and they named the buildings for things like the barn and the stable and the chicken coop. And it was an old French movie studio, so there was a theater there, that was obvious. They had a swimming pool, and one was a pool hall. So all those names fit in. But one of the guys that was living in front of the pool hall was a real character. One day, well, almost all the doors had these little openings, and we call them peephole, peeps for short. And that's what they'd open up and look, check on you every morning and during the day or at night or whatever. One of the guards came by one day and did that. And after he walked off, this fella tapped to his neighbor next door, says, "This is the first zoo I've ever been in where the animals look at the people." And from then on, it was the zoo. After the zoo, sometime during the summer of '70, the Vietnamese were readying a new facility for us at an existing army post out again to the west of Hanoi. And they had moved at least two groups in there earlier. One of them from the Hanoi, from the San Tay prison where the raid took place later on. But it was the first time we had had compound living, so to speak. It was a big, long barracks that was divided into several rooms. Excuse me. But after a few days, we were all out together. They'd come in, just unlock the doors in the morning. We had to run to the place till siesta time, noonish, when they'd put us back in for a couple hours, and then we'd be back out. We had to run to the place till time to lock up to go to bed. We had a latrine area and a wash shower area. It definitely, it was not Hogan's Heroes, but it was so much better than anything we had had. We were getting sunshine, exercise, and then the San Tay raid popped in, and that was about 6-7 miles away. We heard all the fireworks and see the airplanes and activity, and it scared the bejesus out of the Vietnamese. 2 days later, we were all loaded up, now taken back down to the big prison, Waldrop, downtown. And they had opened up an area in the back that we knew was back there because when I was there before, we could hear people back in there. They'd been using it for political prisoners as well as South Vietnamese prisoners they'd captured. And these cell blocks were roughly 25 feet by about 55 or 60. And they had up to 100 to 120 South Vietnamese in each one, and there were 50 to 57 of us in each one. And on the concrete slabs, you had about that much space. and then had guys laying on bedboards around on the floor. It was a crowded sardine can, but it was so nice to be with people that you'd only heard names of for several years, but now you got a face to go with them, a personality, and you got new people to talk to and new stories to hear. And it was actually fun for a few days. The first stop that I made when we went out to the zoo was in the area that we called the Annex. There was a series of buildings, I think there were 9 or 10 of them, where they stored the film from the studio. And in fact, there were old rolls of film around and so on. And I was in this group of 3 other F-105 pilots that had been shot down in early October. We'd gotten there in late October. But none of us knew anything about the tap code. We'd tried to talk across the wall or do something to the group that was next to us. There were 2 units in each building, but we weren't getting anywhere until the next spring, like March. This Navy lieutenant commander came in who knew the code. He had heard it, but he hadn't had a chance to use it. Wasn't very good at it. But we were over trying to get the guys next door to respond, and they was tapping on the wall, and we were giving names, and they were giving their names back.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but how did the code work? Was it a form of Morse code, or
No,
how'd you know which letter was what tap?
well, the quick background is one of the very early Air Force officers, I think he was number 6 or 7, shot down, had been talking to a German POW, one of ours who was a German POW in World War II, and talked about this code. And Smitty asked him, what is it? Is it Morse code? No, it's a little matrix, 5 by 5. Excuse me. You drop out the letter K because you can get the same sound using a C. It's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right on down. And to tap it, you tap, the first tap is for the row, and the second tap's for the column. So a B would be 1, 2, 2. And my initial W was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, dot, dot. A, dot, dot. And it seems cumbersome till you get it and get going. And once you get established doing it, it's like a lot of other things. You pick up a word from the context and you can get them to go on. And you can do it even faster than the telegraph key, I think. It was a lifesaver for us. But this first effort was really cumbersome. And when they were given their names back, this one came out, as I mentioned, there's no K, you use the C. It came back H-I-C-C-E, something that doesn't make any sense. So you get him an error and get him to do it again. And about the 3rd time, I don't know why it popped in my mind. I said H-I-C, and then all of a sudden I remembered saying, ask if that's Jim. And so he went back, Jim, and came back, yes, and it's Jim Hickerson. And we had been fraternity brothers down here at Georgia Tech, stood side by side at initiation. He went in the Navy right away when I had that delay at Lockheed, but we'd seen each other about 2 years after. Both of us had our wings, but that would have been 10 years later right there in Hanoi. But it was after he and I were then moved, as we call it, across the wall into the main prison. He was up in the barn and I was in the pool hall. So we didn't communicate until about 2 years later when we had what I call a fruit basket turnover, and he moved in next door to me and had taken some of the bricks out of the windows, and I got to lean in and shake hands with him. But then when we went out to the camp we call Faith at the compound living, and then back into the other, we stayed together for the next 2.5, almost 2 years.
Thinking about the whole experience, you had to go through a range of, I shouldn't say you had to, I would imagine you went through a range of emotions.
Definitely.
In the beginning, you're a new opportunity for them. And then there must reach a point where the enemy says, we've done everything with this guy that's of value to us we can do, and now you just become, I shouldn't say just become, now you're a prisoner. When you think back, I mean, there had to be fear, boredom, hunger. I mean, how do you describe the stages of your imprisonment and what it did to you?
Well, first off was the startling realization that Air Force intelligence at survival school was out of touch with the real world. Because I asked the question as part of the process, what do you know about the POWs? So you're probably aware of the Hanoi March that had happened in the summer of '66. Oh, and by the way, one of the Navy guys was shot down a couple of days before that happened, and they put him in. He got down and got the prison, and his quote was one of the famous ones. He said, "You guys do this very often?" But I was concerned about it, and the sergeant told me in the Philippines, "Oh, we've had reports of really good treatment up there." I said they've been seen out in town at night and in restaurants and theaters and stuff. And I'd been there about a week when I settled down enough, wish I could get my hands on that sergeant again. And also a Marine from Korea. But anyway, I was not prepared for the immediate torture, to be candid. Obviously, in survival school, we were taught name, rank, serial number, date of birth, according to the code of conduct, and evade further question to the best of your ability. But a German POW fellow, U.S. Air Force, who had been German POW when I was there, made the statement that if you have something that they want, they will get it. If you're by yourself, they'll get it out of you. If they're more than one, beware of things they'll do to play you off each other to get it. So once I got the name, rank, serial number, date of birth, and they said, "What was your target?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And his English wasn't that good, but I could understand it. But I used the fact that I couldn't to get him to repeat things to buy time to think about what I was doing and saying. But anyway, he let me know right away that name, rank, serial number is not going to cut it. Oh, in fact, that's one of the humorous things. I told you about faking that injury up in the mountain to get them to carry me. I tried the same thing with the Chinese. They brought in a doctor. He checked me out. Said, "No, you're okay." I said, "No, you're okay." When I get to Hanoi, now I'm in a new venue. So when the interrogator comes in, he says, "Sit." And he was at a table with this light little gooseneck thing down here with a stool down. He says, "Sit." So I start like I'm going to hobble over there. And he looks up and he says, "Maybe you best actor in survival school, but now you in Hanoi. Sit down." That alerted me. This guy is not a dummy. He's in touch. And over the course of the night, he convinced me that their intelligence was immediately up to date. He asked me 2 questions over the course. One I'd been briefed on it the day before I was shot down, and one the day I was shot down as top secret. And he asked me why this happened. First one was why the 104 or the F4s no longer fly MiG cap. And I said, "You mean they weren't up there today? I thought they were." And then he says, "Why can you not fly over Hanoi below 10,000 feet now?" And we'd just been briefed on that day because there's a French delegation in town. So once that confirmed that I got to be serious about this. And when he was asking these questions, "What was your target?" I said, "I don't know. I was a spare. I pulled in. I just followed them." Who else was in your flight? I don't know. Who's in your squadron? Well, I'm new. I've only been there a short time. He kept pressing for names, so I started coming up with guys from high school and from tech who were 4F or never in. I threw in some names of guys that finished their mission and gone home to be good. And I kept cranking this, and finally, after I don't know how many hours, and several times of tying me up and passing out and coming back to consciousness, he said, "Why do you keep lying?" I said, I'm not lying. They said, yeah, you lie. Same day we shoot down man 357 Squadron, tells us everything. And I thought about that a minute, and I said, well, if he tells you, why you ask me? He said, I want to hear you say. So we're back to the game again. Name, rank, serial number, write down all the same questions. And I remember from survival school, if you're telling a lie and somebody else telling the truth, the liar's in trouble. And I thought, oh gosh, if he really did tell them, I'm in trouble. So I started pulling my answers back to more factual things, but not quite as best I could, but sweating it out. And finally, when he quit about daylight, and this had started a little after dark the night before, and I got the day off, and I lay there, and they brought me some soup and rice to eat, and I got to thinking, he really conned me. He played all those things they told me about in survival school. He did it, and then I bought it hook, line. There ain't nobody else up here now. There you go. And I never heard any reference about another guy till I got to the zoo with those new 105 pilots. And one of the guys had been at the other base at Korat. And he said, I knew about you. You were shot down the same day as Ward died. And he was a flight leader in another squad. I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah, he and another guy were shot down that day. They were 357th Squadron. So, yeah, they had the guy. They put him out as died in captivity about a week later. And once I got through the fear, and I mentioned the next day when I said he really hooked me, I got to shape up here and start earning my pay as a major in the United States Air Force. They came in the next morning and says, today you write your autobiography. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's Yokota Tonka. You won't write. He said, I'll order you to. I said, I don't take orders from you. None of these guys wore rank, so you didn't know who you were talking to really, but they all look like kids. As you know, Orientals tend to look much younger than they are for a long, long time. But we went through that, and they said, well, I bring in a camp commander. He orders you to write. I said, okay. So he goes, and I was really being this flippant and blasé, no kidding. So he comes back in a few minutes with a guy about his age, same size. He says, now this is the camp commander. And I said to myself, oh yeah, this was Saturday morning. I said, oh yeah, these guys were out drinking beer last night. They said, oh, we're going to have some fun with a new guy. He asked, will you write your autobiography? I said, nope. They talked in Vietnamese. He says, he asked you one last time. I said, no. He talked to me. He says, he orders you to write your autobiography. I said, I take my orders from the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. And he talked a little more in Vietnamese, and he says, one more time? I shook my head. And the camp commander looks up in very good English and says, you will be very sorry. Got up and walked out. 2 or 3 minutes later, this big guy comes in, biggest Vietnamese I saw. And they put me on the ground, pulled my arms back up behind me. I couldn't do it again. My life depended on it. My palms were together behind my neck. I could scratch my neck. And they put Vietnamese handcuffs right there. And they walked out. And I thought, this ain't a big deal. And about 5 minutes later, my hands were numb, my arms were numb, and shortly my shoulders were numb, and pretty soon my chest was numb. And so I started walking around so I could keep myself alert and active, I thought. Next thing I knew, I'm laying on the floor. I'd obviously fallen like that. And I did that 3 or 4 times, so I just gave up, quit trying to walk around. And during the mealtime, at mealtime comes in with a bowl of soup and a plate of rice and holds it up. And I said, oh, good. We're going to get a break here and get something to eat. He holds it up, sets it on the table, and he does that. And I shook my head. He walked over and picked it up and walked out. Maybe they are serious about this. Okay, I'll lay here a while longer. So I guess I passed out off and on, because the next time, the afternoon meal time came, he comes in with the soup and rice again, sets it down to that. And I said, no. But I had been conscious enough during the time that I realized I hadn't seen another American. I've been here for 4 days now. And this was the funny part. I haven't felt my hands all day. This is into the afternoon. I haven't felt anything from my waist up in a good while. If I can't use my hands, I can't feed myself, and I probably can't play golf again. So when he starts to pick up the stuff to go away, I said, wait a minute. And he turned around, does that, and I said, I'll try. He picks it up. And I said, okay. He turned around and nodded my head. He wouldn't leave till I said yes. So he left the suit, went out and got the officer, came back, and the officer asked me, and I tried with him, I'll try. And he shook his head. So I said, okay. So he takes the handcuffs off, and I'd been through rope tying up before, and when they do that, the whole purpose is to cut off circulation, and when they release it, it's like grabbing an electric wire. If you've ever been shocked, you know, by a house girl. Well, this time when he came off, I was just shook all over. And they brought in a little booklet, like I never had it down here, but they call it test booklets, you know, the little blue book sort of thing lined with a whole thing of questions. Sit down and write. And so for about 3 or 4 days, I'd sit there and hold a pen in my mouth and push it around with my hands. And I'd get 6 or 8 words on a page that way and use up stuff. And there was questions, what's your name? And I put it down. What's your father's name? I put daddy. What's your mother's name? I put mommy. Where were you born? I put early age. You know, just Mickey Mouse. See, I don't know. I guess I was so beaten down by this point I didn't really care what they did. I was going to have some fun in the process. But they never referred to that again. And it proved, for me at least, the whole point was we can make you do it. What that sergeant had said. We'll show you that we run this camp. You'll do what we tell you to do. So from then on, it's a game of how much I could keep them from doing. And then that night, when you were asking, this was really my low point. When I ate that meal and realized that I had been broken. And so then over here, we had a big thunderstorm. It rained, and I was so thirsty. They hadn't given me any water except when the interrogator would be there, and he'd have a cup and offer it. And I remember I got up and I pulled the table over, put the chair on it, put the stool on it, and got up where I could get this vent, and reached out and got a hold of a limb on the tree so that the rain coming down and run down, and I get some water off my arm. And then it quit raining about the time I got it. And so I went over and leaned up against a wall, just slumped down, and there was one light way over in the corner. And I looked up, and it just kept attracting my attention. And I remember thinking it was like Moses in the burning bush, I guess. And I sat there and I looked at the light. And whether it was a split second or an hour, I can't tell you. But I had an experience of something happened to me, and it was all over. I was feel very comfortable, very secure. You're going to live, you're going to get out of this, and you'll go home someday. And from then on, I was able to accept things that happened, and when there would be a crackdown right after escape in a night camp, and other things that come down, you'd have a little sense that this might be bad. I could just think about it for a minute, and I could feel comfortable again and go on and do what I had to do. And I remember thinking Harry Truman made the statement as president that he had no trouble sleeping every night because he knew he had done the best that day that he knew to do, and he needed his rest for the next day. And I realized that I was able to do that. I could lie down every night and go to sleep no matter what was going on.
And how long had you been a prisoner when that happened?
I was shot down on Wednesday afternoon, and that was Saturday night.
So
3 days.
3 days after you were shot down, you feel you had a moment that gave you, I won't call it peace, but gave you something that got you through the rest of those years.
Yep.
Was there a day in that prison camp after that that you didn't feel that awareness or didn't think about that? Or did that sustain you every single day?
I can't say that I thought it consciously every day, but the feeling was there every day.
And what do you think about that now? What do you think that was?
It still sustains me, and the experience that I had there after we were in those large groups, we started, after some confrontations with the Vietnamese, we started having Sunday church services. And I thought about it a lot. You know, what does this mean to me? What do I do? And I participated, not as an activist, but participated in the services, attended. And when I got home, I went to see another one of our classmates down here at Georgia Tech who had become an Episcopal minister. And I talked to him about it and asked him, well, how did you make the transition? Because he had been a technical major. How did you make the transition to the Atomic experience? And the first assignment I had when I got back was at the Air War College. And one of my classmates there was a Catholic priest that I got to know fairly well. And I was still in this time, you know, I was saved in that ejection. I went through this other experience. What am I here for? And the Catholic priest helped me put it in the best perspective. He said, don't try to solve the problem. He said, you go through your life looking for the sign or looking for this or what. And he said, you may miss what you're actually here for. He said, just accept the fact that you're here and make the most of it that you can. And that's really what's been with me ever since.
Not like 5.5, almost 6 years a prisoner. How did you find out you were going home and when you were going home? And tell me about that experience.
Well, to put it all in perspective, when Nixon started the bombing again in May of '72, we were in the big prison there at Wallow. And somebody that went to quiz, as we called the interrogations, because it was easier to say and to tap, brought back a message that Nixon is crazy man. We don't know what happens now. But we had in our camp one South Vietnamese prisoner and 3 Thai prisoners who were allowed out to work and do things, and of course they were speaking the language, and they were really our intelligence. And we got a heads up that 209 was the number, literally, were going to be moved out of camp. And sure enough, about a week later, 209 of us were moved right up to the Chinese border, deep in the mountains, and a camp that we thought initially was new to us. We learned later on that others had been there ahead of us, who I don't know. But we spent the rest of '72 there and over the winter. And in October, we didn't have radios in each cell there. They didn't have power like we had back in the big prison. We had these little radios in each room, and you got these propaganda broadcasts. Hanoi, Hanoi, we call it, the voice of Vietnam, all the garbage. Up here, they had to do it by quizzes. And one of the fellows that went early picked up, they were asking him, what do you think about this proposed end of the war, or whatever? This is in early October. And then I was called out right at the end of October. And he asked me, he said, are you disappointed there was no settlement in October? I said, no, I didn't know there was going to be one. So how can I be disappointed for something I didn't know was going to happen? Wasn't going to happen anyway. And kind of went on with that. And then over Christmas and the holiday and New Year's, it got really cold and we were settling in. All of us were looking to be there in the winter. And one night, the building I was in up the top of the hill, one of the fellows woke us up and said, we just had 3 trucks come into camp. So we all stayed up and we counted 17 trucks. You don't need that many to bring in a month's load of food. Something is up. And the guards came around that morning and let us out to go out to to eat or to shave, whatever we were going to do. We had a little area, kind of a little patio we could get out to in our building. And he looks around at one of the other guys and he does this. And then he goes back like that. Looks over, something is really up here. So we went back in, and just so we didn't miss out on it, we all started rolling up our gear. That afternoon when the guard came around and opened it up, and he gives us this, which was the signal to roll up, ready to move, we just all leaned over, patted our roll. He got a big smile on his face, and right after dark, they loaded us on the trucks, headed back to Hanoi, and about halfway down mid-afternoon, we stopped and had a little coffee break. They gave us water and little energy bars, coconut bar stuff. And instead of getting back on the truck necessarily to your own, they divided us out in 4 categories. And what turned out to be the first 2 release groups went back to the big prison. The 3rd release group went to the one we called a plantation, and the 4th one went to the zoo. And, excuse me, we'd been back about a week, and I was at the plantation in the 3rd group. They called us out one afternoon. We lined up, and the camp commander came over, and he read us the protocol from the Paris Treaty that in itself required that the prisoners be notified within 48 hours of this date. And they were told it, and they stood there for a few minutes waiting for us to do something, and when we didn't, they said, okay, dismissed, and we all filed back into our own little cells, and then we went up hugging each other. So, God, I hope it's true, hope it's true. In my particular case, I was pulled out and taken up to Wallow. It turns out that after the first release group, there was a little difference of opinion between, and the conditions for release were that everybody would be released in 4 equal increments over the next 60 days. So, and with the sick and wounded being released first. Well, the U.S. expected that to be release the sick and wounded, then 4 more increments. The Vietnamese interpreted to be the sick and wounded would be in the first increment. So they had a little hassle about that. And somehow they came up and released 20 guys, just pulled almost at random, came out. So as that was going on, I was pulled up to the 2nd release group. Then they decided, no, the count didn't work. So I went back to the plantation. And then they pulled me out again. And whatever the problem was, we were supposed to be released on the 1st of March. And the camp commander came in, and we had the big, going away thing, special dinner, blah, 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 on the night of last night in February. And then he told us, he said, maybe you do not go tomorrow. There is a small problem. I will let you know. So the next morning he comes in and said, I don't think so today. And that night he said, maybe tomorrow. And then by March the 3rd, we were said, oh, to hell with it. I hope somebody got out of here anyway. And he came in that night and he says, I think tomorrow, okay. And sure enough, the next morning he comes in and came in. There was a group called, I forget the exact name, but they were an Indian, a Canadian, a Czech, and another Soviet Union type had to come around and inspect everybody. So they came through. We figured, I think we might make it today. And sure enough, about an hour later, we started going out. We got our go-home clothes that we'd been fitted for. We went out to pick them up, put them on. And they walked us out the front gate, and they had their little 20-seat buses out there, and we all got on and headed over to Jialam for the big trip home.
I'd like to hear this.
Well, we got out there as we pulled out onto the ramp, and I saw that 141 out there. Of course, working out there, my neighbor at Craig had gotten out of the Air Force and was test pilot in 141, and I'd walked out into one just before I left to go to Southeast Asia. And I saw that airplane, the United States of America, and that big flag up there. And I told a lot of people, when I walked down and walked up that ramp, I could smell the red clay out of North Georgia. I knew I was going home.
Is that just an expression, or did you really feel like you smelled? I mean,
I started feeling like I'm headed home, yeah.
Well, the one question I want to ask you, the penultimate, next to the last, is a lot of things changed for you while you were a prisoner. You found out about losing your father and losing other family members and your wife. And again, if you don't mind my asking, what sustained you through that?
Well, I had premonitions, or indications, I guess you'd say, on both. I only got 2 letters from my wife, and there were 6 lines, but she only used about 4 of them. So all she just said was, the children are fine, they help a lot. Another one was, I moved to Atlanta to go to Emory, the children doing well. You could almost read into it the indifference. And in the case of my dad, the one thing that I got from my mother was a birthday card that was signed Love, Mother. And that was probably one of the really low points when I realized he was gone, because I was looking forward to seeing him. I knew he was in bad shape when I left, but I was looking forward to going back and seeing him again. And so when I got there to Clark, we'd been there, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, and he came around and got me and said, there's a colonel up here wants to see you. And he introduced himself from 13th Air Force Headquarters. And we were standing in the doorway to the little ward area that I was in, and I looked up, and a technician that had been seeing me around was leaned up to the desk up here about 20, 30 feet. And I don't know why I turned around. There was another technician back standing around over here. This is not going to be a standard conversation. What is it? So he started out casually, told me about my aunt dying and my uncle dying and my father-in-law dying, and then your father died, and your wife got a divorce. And as I've described it, it wasn't a surprise. It was the shock of confirmation. The things I was hoping weren't true, but I had a sense. And it was kind of ironic when I learned about more detail about my wife's divorce. When I was up in the mountains and I hadn't gotten anything, heard anything, I went to a quiz and I asked an officer whom I'd known from way back at the zoo. I said, I hadn't heard anything from my wife in a long time. I said, I'm wondering if maybe something has happened. He said, no, I think everything's fine. And I said, well, I would really like to know. I don't want my children to be hurting or having any problem. He said, okay, I ask. And several months later, I went to quiz with him again, and he said, I asked. He said, I think everything okay. As it turns out, that first quiz was within a week of when she filed for the divorce, and the second one was within a week of when it was granted. And they had sent the paperwork to Hanoi, to captivity pension, and since I didn't reply within 30 days, I wasn't contesting it. Well, I was still going through the checkout down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama, but my mother wanted to get the family together at home and visit, and so I flew up commercially, and my ex-wife was here in town at the time. She came out and picked me up at the airport, and we went over to her house, and we were talking. I was going to take my children out with me for this party, and we were sitting there talking. She said, how you plan on getting to Bremen? I said, oh, gosh. Thought it hadn't crossed my mind. Oh, well, I'll rent a car. Oh, no, I guess I can't do that. I don't have a driver's license. Why? I didn't think of riding the bus. I don't know, because that'd been right off the bat. I thought, well, maybe Pat will rent me an airplane, because I had a pilot's license, commercial license, and I wasn't thinking of the fact that you got to have a medical to make it effective. But she said, well, you better do something. So this is getting kind of late if you're going out there tomorrow. So I called him up. I don't know, I guess we were looking at the phone book. I got him at home. And I said, hey, you got any airplane you might rent out tomorrow? He says, what for? I said, well, I need to get out to Bremen with me and the children. He said, when you want to go? And I said, oh, sometime mid-morning or so. And he says, hold on a minute. Looked around and he said, how's about 10 o'clock? Would that be good? 10:30? I said, yeah, it'd be fine. So he said, well, you know how to get out to my place? And I said, yeah. He said, all right, I'll see you then. So we come driving up out here, and it turns out he had a demonstration set up for a hope for sale with a King Air, I think it was. Anyways, about an 8 or 10 place airplane. And this company, people were here, and they were really nice, welcoming us in. And said, yeah, we'll be glad. And they gave me a ride out to West Georgia Airport, and my brother was there to pick me up. But Pat and I have laughed about that a lot of times.
Those 6 years of your life that you gave, literally gave to this country, and all that happened to you, what would you say to young people? Or what would you, if you could get them all to pay attention to you for the next minute, what would you say?
Well, first I would say that I'm proud of my service. At the time I was there, I honestly believed that we were doing something that needed to be done, because the threat of communism and the expansion of China and their efforts to, particularly in Asia and in Southeast Asia, could have had very difficult future. And while we did not win, and unfortunately I think I have to say we actually did win the combat. Our politicians gave it away later on. But we did accomplish a stalemate, so to speak, and I think we stopped that expansion, gave those countries a chance to get on a little firmer basis. As far as Vietnamese people, I was disappointed for them, the boat people, that many were killed or died in the process of getting out of there, and in Cambodia that were literally killed during the Pol Pot regime. I don't think we can take any pride at all in allowing that to happen. But when we finally started recognizing the Vietnamese, I was asked by one of the local stations, what do you think about it with the trade and then the recognition? And I said, well, we're going over there to give them a chance for self-determination, and it looks like they're finally going to get it. And on the 2 trips I've made back over there, I think we really did win the hearts and minds, because they really like Americans there now. But for the status now and the condition and the future of this country, I have real concern. The last few years, the mood of the country, the culture of the country, society have changed in ways that I cannot say that I feel proud about. But I do talk to enough young people who have good attitudes and good patriotic values that I'm optimistic that they will rise to.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.